The desert wind carries secrets older than memory itself across the Giza plateau, whispering through limestone crevices and dancing around the massive triangular monuments that have dominated this landscape for more than 45 centuries. And as Dr. Sarah Chin pressed her palm against the weathered stone of the Great Pyramid on that sweltering August morning in 2024, she could feel the vibrations of something far below, a rhythmic pulse that seemed to emanate from the very bedrock beneath her feet, something that her team's latest ground-penetrating radar scans had only begun to reveal, and what they had found in those scans had changed everything they thought they knew about what lay beneath these ancient monuments. The story of what exists under the pyramids is not one of dusty tombs and forgotten treasures alone, but rather a complex narrative woven through millennia of construction, natural geological processes, deliberate engineering, and perhaps most intriguingly, recent technological discoveries that have unveiled hidden chambers and massive underground structures that challenge our understanding of ancient Egyptian capabilities. And to truly comprehend the magnitude of what lies beneath requires us to journey backward through time, to witness how these subterranean realms were created, what purposes they served, and what modern science continues to discover lurking in the darkness far below the sand. When Pharaoh Khufu ascended to power in approximately 2580 BCE, he inherited not just a kingdom but a theological imperative that demanded his eternal preservation, and the pyramid that would bear his name would not simply rise into the sky, but would plunge deep into the earth as well, because the ancient Egyptians understood death as a journey that required both ascension toward the stars and descent into the primordial waters of creation, a concept embodied in their mythology through the god Osiris and the underworld realm of the Duat. And so the workers began not by stacking stones upward, but by cutting downward into the living rock of the plateau, carving passages that descended at a precise 26-degree angle into the bedrock, tunneling through solid limestone in a feat of engineering that still astonishes modern archaeologists. The descending passage, as it would come to be known, extends nearly 100 meters from the pyramid's entrance, dropping through the carefully laid courses of limestone blocks and continuing deep into the natural plateau beneath, its walls cut with such precision that even today, more than 4,000 years later, you can run your hand along the surface and feel how smooth the ancient workers made the stone, though they possessed only copper tools and stone hammers. And this passage leads to what is perhaps the most enigmatic space within the entire pyramid complex, the subterranean chamber, a vast room carved directly from the bedrock approximately 30 meters beneath the base of the pyramid, its ceiling rough and uneven, its floor interrupted by a deep pit whose purpose has baffled researchers for centuries. For generations, Egyptologists dismissed this chamber as unfinished, theorizing that Khufu had changed his plans midway through construction and decided to move his burial chamber higher into the pyramid structure, which would explain why the chamber appears rough and incomplete compared to the polished precision of the upper galleries and chambers. Yet recent studies have challenged this conventional wisdom, suggesting instead that the subterranean chamber was never intended to be finished in the traditional sense, that its seemingly chaotic features, the rough walls, the irregular ceiling, the mysterious pit, and the narrow tunnels that branch off from it might actually represent something far more significant than an abandoned construction project. Dr. R. Obert Schock, a geologist who has extensively studied the Giza Plateau, has noted that the pit in the subterranean chamber descends an additional 3 meters into the bedrock, and its walls show evidence of careful excavation rather than haphazard digging, suggesting intentional design. And when you examine the layout of this chamber through the lens of ancient Egyptian religious texts, particularly the pyramid texts inscribed in later pyramids, a fascinating possibility emerges. This chamber might represent a physical manifestation of the primordial waters of Nun, the cosmic ocean from which all creation emerged, according to Egyptian mythology. And if this interpretation is correct, then the subterranean chamber was never meant to be a burial place at all, but rather a symbolic space representing the deepest level of the underworld, the place where the dead pharaoh would need to pass through on his journey to resurrection. But the Great Pyramid's subterranean features extend beyond just this single chamber, because from the descending passage, approximately 18 meters below the pyramid's base, a tunnel known as the Well Shaft ascends irregularly through the bedrock and the pyramid's masonry, eventually connecting to the upper passage system. And this shaft presents one of the great puzzles of pyramid architecture because, unlike the precisely engineered galleries and chambers, the well shaft is rough, uneven, and clearly cut through existing structure rather than built as part of the original design. And theories about its purpose range from the practical, perhaps it served as an escape route for workers who sealed the ascending passage after the pharaoh's burial, to the metaphysical. It might represent a pathway for the pharaoh's spirit to travel between the underworld and the heavens. But what makes this shaft particularly intriguing from a modern archaeological perspective is that its very existence proves that the pyramid's internal structure is far more complex than the elegant cross-section diagrams in. Textbooks suggest that there are passages and spaces within and beneath the pyramid that were created for purposes we still don't fully understand. The subterranean chamber itself is not the only underground feature of the Great Pyramid, because as archaeologists have mapped the area surrounding the monument, they have discovered a network of shafts, tunnels, and cavities that extend beyond the pyramid's footprint, suggesting that the ancient builders conceived of the entire plateau as a three-dimensional construction site, not just a flat surface upon which to build. And this understanding becomes even more profound when we consider what lies beneath the other pyramids of Giza, particularly the pyramid of Khafre, Khufu's successor, where recent technological advances have revealed underground structures that may dwarf anything found beneath the Great Pyramid itself. In November 2025, a team of Italian and Scottish researchers using advanced synthetic aperture radar technology, a technique that can detect micro movements in stone structures caused by underground voids and chambers, announced findings that sent shockwaves through the archaeological community because their scans of the area beneath and around Khafre's pyramid revealed what appeared to be a vast network of vertical shafts and interconnected chambers extending more than 600 meters, nearly 2,000 feet, into the bedrock beneath the plateau, structures so massive and so deep that they challenge everything we thought we knew about the technological capabilities of ancient Egypt and the purposes for which these monuments were constructed. The radar images, published in a controversial paper that immediately sparked intense debate among Egyptologists, appeared to show 8 distinct vertical cylinder-shaped structures, each several meters in diameter, descending from near the base of Khafre's pyramid straight down through the limestone bedrock, these shafts appearing to be connected by horizontal passages and chambers at various depths, creating what the researchers described as a three-dimensional lattice of underground spaces. And while many mainstream archaeologists have expressed skepticism about these findings, demanding direct excavation to confirm what the radar seems to show, the images themselves are undeniably intriguing, showing clear architectural features that appear too regular to be natural geological formations, too purposefully arranged to be random cavities in the rock. What makes these potential discoveries even more fascinating is that they align with historical accounts that have persisted for millennia, because the Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, nearly 2,000 years after the pyramids were built, described underground chambers beneath the Giza plateau, claiming that the Egyptian priests had told him about artificial chambers hollowed out beneath the pyramid site. And in his histories, Herodotus writes, "The 10 years aforesaid went to the making of this road and of the underground chambers on the hill whereon the pyramids stand. These the king meant to be burial places for himself, and encompassed them with water, bringing in a channel from the Nile." And for centuries, scholars dismissed this account as exaggeration or misunderstanding. Yet the more we discover about what actually exists beneath the pyramids, the more we wonder if Herodotus was recording genuine information about subterranean structures that have since been lost, forgotten, or deliberately concealed. The mention of water is particularly significant because we now know that the water table beneath the Giza plateau has fluctuated dramatically over the millennia, and several of the known underground features associated with the pyramids show clear evidence of water-related design and damage. And nowhere is this more evident than in the mysterious structure known as the Osiris Shaft, discovered in the late 1992 by Dr. Zahi Hawass and his team, located beneath the causeway that connects Khafre's pyramid to its valley temple. This extraordinary three-level underground complex descends approximately 30 meters below the plateau surface, and its lowest level, cut into the bedrock and accessible only through increasingly narrow vertical shafts, is deliberately flooded, creating an underground lake that surrounds a massive granite sarcophagus resting on a raised platform in the center of the chamber. The Osiris Shaft, named for its apparent symbolic connection to the myth of Osiris, the god of death and resurrection who was associated with water in the Nile, represents perhaps the most tangible evidence we have of the ancient Egyptians creating elaborate subterranean structures far beneath the pyramid complex. And when you descend through the shaft, which few people are permitted to do as it remains largely closed to the public, you pass through 3 distinct levels, each cut from the solid rock with remarkable precision despite being hidden far beneath the ground. And at the second level, archaeologists found 6 chambers containing pottery, bones, and 2 granite sarcophagi, artifacts that have been dated to around 500 BCE, suggesting that this complex was used, and possibly modified, long after the pyramids themselves were built. But the construction of the shaft, particularly its lowest level, appears to be much older, possibly contemporary with the pyramid construction or even earlier, raising the intriguing possibility that some of the underground features of Giza predate the pyramids themselves, that the ancient builders were incorporating and building around existing subterranean structures whose origins and purposes have been lost to history. The flooded chamber at the bottom of the Osiris Shaft is accessed by descending through increasingly narrow vertical shafts cut through the bedrock. And when you finally emerge into the chamber itself, you find yourself standing on the edge of dark water, the ceiling low and oppressive above you, the temperature noticeably cooler than the desert heat far above. And in the center of this underground lake, illuminated by whatever lights the archaeological team has brought with them, sits an enormous granite sarcophagus, empty and enigmatic, its purpose unknown. And surrounding it, also rising from the water on raised platforms, are pillars and architectural elements that suggest this was once a much larger complex, perhaps partially collapsed or deliberately flooded in antiquity. And the entire scene evokes exactly what the ancient texts describe as the primordial mound of creation, emerging from the waters of none, a physical recreation of Egyptian cosmology hidden beneath the ground, accessible only to those who knew the secret passages and were willing to descend into the darkness. But the Osiris Shaft, remarkable as it is, may represent only a tiny fraction of what exists beneath the Giza Plateau, because the 2025 Real Radar findings, controversial though they remain, suggest underground structures that are far more extensive, far deeper, and far more complex than anything that has been directly excavated. And if even a portion of what the radar appears to show is real, if there truly are shaft systems descending hundreds of meters into the bedrock, connected by passages and chambers, then we must radically revise our understanding not only of ancient Egyptian engineering capabilities, but also of their motivations. Because why would a civilization invest such enormous effort in creating vast underground structures that seemingly serve no practical purpose, that could not be used for storage or habitation, that were deliberately hidden and difficult to access, unless those structures fulfilled some religious, ceremonial, or symbolic function that we have yet to fully comprehend? The connection between underground water and pyramid construction appears throughout the Giza complex. And recent geological studies have revealed that the pyramids were built along what was once a major tributary of the Nile River, a branch that researchers have named the Ahramat Branch, which flowed much closer to the pyramid plateau than the current Nile channel. And this ancient waterway would have made it possible for the builders to transport massive stone blocks by boat directly to the construction site. But more intriguingly, it also would have meant that the water table beneath the plateau was significantly higher during the pyramid construction period than it is today, potentially flooding or partially flooding subterranean chambers and creating the water-surrounded spaces that Herodotus described and that we see in structures like the Osiris Shaft. Dr. Judith Bunbury, a geoarchaeologist at the University of Cambridge who has extensively studied the ancient hydrology of the Giza area, has demonstrated through sediment analysis and geophysical surveys that the landscape during the Old Kingdom period, when the pyramids were built, was dramatically different from today's arid desert environment. The Nile had multiple branches that shifted over time, and the area around Giza would have been much greener, more fertile, and crucially, wetter, with the groundwater level potentially 20 or 30 meters higher than it is today. And this has profound implications for understanding the underground structures, because it means that chambers, which today are dry and dusty, might once have been filled with water, either seasonally or permanently. And if the ancient Egyptians were deliberately incorporating water into their underground architecture, then we need to understand why water was so theologically important to them, and the answer lies in their cosmology and their understanding of death and rebirth. In the Egyptian conception of the universe, water was the primordial element from which everything emerged. The god Nun personified the infinite cosmic ocean that existed before creation, and from these waters, the first mound of earth emerged, and upon this mound, the creator god brought forth all existence. And when a person died, they had to journey through the Duat, the underworld, which was envisioned as a dark place filled with water and obstacles, and the soul would travel through this watery realm, facing challenges and judgments, before emerging reborn like the sun god Ra, who died each night and was reborn each dawn. And so water in funerary architecture was not just symbolic, it was literally recreating the cosmic geography through which the dead needed to travel, providing them with a physical space that matched the metaphysical reality they would encounter in the afterlife. This explains why chambers like the lowest level of the Osiris Shaft are deliberately flooded, why Herodotus mentions underground chambers encompassed with water, and why the subterranean chamber of the Great Pyramid, with its deep pit and mysterious features, might have been intended to interact with groundwater, creating a literal underworld beneath the pyramid. And if this interpretation is correct, then the recently discovered deep shaft systems suggested by the SAR radar scans take on a profound new meaning. They might represent an attempt to create an elaborate three-dimensional model of the Duat itself, with vertical shafts representing the descent into the underworld, horizontal passages representing the journey through its various regions, and water-filled chambers representing the primordial ocean through which the soul must pass to achieve resurrection. The technological sophistication required to construct such underground complexes would have been extraordinary, and yet we have ample evidence that the ancient Egyptians possessed exactly such capabilities, because beyond the pyramids themselves, Egypt is riddled with underground structures that demonstrate advanced engineering. The Valley of the Kings, for instance, contains tombs that tunnel deep into the mountain rock, some extending more than 100 meters into the cliff face, with multiple chambers, corridors, and shafts, all cut with precision through solid limestone and decorated with elaborate paintings and inscriptions. And these tombs prove that Egyptian workers could efficiently excavate complex underground structures, could maintain accurate angles and measurements while working in darkness beneath the earth, could create ventilation systems to provide air to workers deep underground, and could solve the engineering challenges of removing debris, supporting unstable rock, and preventing collapse. At Giza specifically, we have other evidence of subterranean construction capabilities, including the elaborate underground structures associated with the Sphinx, the oldest and largest monumental statue in Egypt, and recent research has suggested that there may be chambers beneath or within the Sphinx itself, because in the early 1990 seconds, seismic surveys conducted around the monument revealed what appeared to be rectangular chambers or voids beneath the paws of the Sphinx, and possibly beneath the structure itself. And while these findings remain controversial and have not been confirmed through excavation, the seismic data is intriguing enough that many researchers believe there is something beneath the Sphinx, whether natural cavities, artificial chambers, or something else entirely. The Sphinx has been associated with underground mysteries since ancient times, with various traditions and legends claiming that secret chambers or passages lie hidden beneath or around it, and some of these legends speak of a hall of records, supposedly containing knowledge from a lost civilization. Though such claims venture far into pseudo-archaeology and have no credible evidence to support them, but the fact remains that the Sphinx sits on the same plateau as the pyramids, was carved from the same bedrock, and would have been created by the same culture that demonstrated clear interest in underground construction, so the possibility of chambers associated with the Sphinx cannot be dismissed outright, even if we reject the more fantastical claims about what those chambers might contain. Whatever. we can say with certainty is that the Giza Plateau is honeycombed with ancient shafts, tunnels, and chambers, some connected to the major monuments, others apparently independent, and many of these features remain unexplored or only partially documented because Egyptology has traditionally focused more on what we can see above ground, the temples, the pyramids, the statues and inscriptions, while the subterranean realm has received comparatively less attention, partly because excavating underground is difficult, expensive, and potentially dangerous, especially in an archaeological context, where you cannot simply dig wherever you want, but must carefully preserve everything you encounter, document it thoroughly, and ensure that your excavation does not damage the very structures you are trying to study. This began to change with the advent of non-invasive scanning technologies, and the ScanPyramids project, launched in 2015, represents perhaps the most ambitious attempt yet to peer inside and beneath these ancient monuments without having to physically dig or drill, using muon tomography, a technique that detects cosmic ray particles called muons as they pass through stone. The researchers can create images of the pyramid's internal structure, because muons pass through empty spaces easily but are absorbed by dense stone. And by placing detectors at various locations and measuring how many muons reach them, you can identify where there are voids or chambers within the structure. And this technique is completely non-invasive, requiring no physical contact with or modification of the monument. In 2017, the ScanPyramids project announced a major discovery. They had detected a large void within the Great Pyramid, a space at least 30 meters long located above the Grand Gallery, and this void, which they termed the Big Void or ScanPyramids Big Void, represents the first major internal structure discovered in the Great Pyramid since the 19th century, and the announcement generated enormous excitement in the archaeological community because it demonstrated that even after more than a century of intensive study, the Great Pyramid still holds secrets, still contains spaces that no modern human has entered, that have remained sealed and hidden for more than 4,000 years. The purpose of this big void remains unknown and hotly debated. Some researchers suggest it might be a relieving chamber, a space designed to reduce the weight load on the Grand Gallery below, similar to the relieving chambers above the King's Chamber. Others propose it could be a sealed chamber with some unknown contents or function, and still others think it might be a passageway leading to yet more undiscovered spaces. But without actually accessing the void, which would require drilling through the pyramid stone, something that Egyptian authorities are understandably reluctant to permit, we can only speculate about what it contains and why it exists. And this uncertainty is both frustrating and tantalizing, because it reminds us that despite all our modern technology, despite satellites and radar and cosmic ray detectors, the pyramids still keep their secrets. Then, in March 2023, the same ScanPyramids team announced another discovery. They had identified and then physically confirmed the existence of a corridor, approximately 9 meters long and about 2 meters high, located above the original entrance to the pyramid, and unlike the Big Void, which remains inaccessible, this corridor was verified by drilling a small endoscopic camera through the stone, and the footage revealed a narrow passage with a distinctive gabled ceiling, empty and apparently leading nowhere. Yet another enigmatic feature of the pyramid's design and the discovery of this corridor, which researchers call the North Face Corridor, raises questions about what other passages and spaces might exist within the pyramid that we have not yet detected, because if muon tomography could miss a corridor-sized feature until recently, what else might be hidden within the monument's massive bulk? But the most controversial and potentially revolutionary discoveries concern not what is inside the pyramids, but what is beneath the entire Giza plateau. And this is where we must carefully separate confirmed archaeological findings from disputed interpretations and outright speculation. Because the 2025 Real radar scans that purportedly show massive underground structures have not been universally accepted by the Egyptological community, and it is crucial to understand both what the scans actually show and why they have generated such intense controversy. Because extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and underground megastructures certainly qualify as extraordinary claims. The research team, led by Italian physicist Dr. Luigi Capasso and Scottish engineer Dr. Ian Henderson, used a sophisticated technique called synthetic aperture radar Doppler tomography, which works by taking multiple radar images of a structure over time and then analyzing minute movements in the stone that might indicate underground voids, because empty spaces beneath a structure can cause microscopic settling or movement that solid bedrock would not, and by detecting and mapping these movements, you can potentially identify the presence and even the shape of underground cavities. And when they applied this technique to Khafre's pyramid, the second pyramid at Giza, they claimed to have detected a pattern of movements consistent with large vertical shafts extending deep beneath the structure. The images they publish show what appear to be 8 distinct cylindrical structures, each several meters in diameter, descending from near the pyramid's base to depths exceeding 600 meters, nearly half a mile, into the earth. And these shafts appear to be connected by horizontal passages at various levels, creating a complex three-dimensional network. And the researchers also claim to see evidence of what they call fluid conduits, passages that might have carried water through this underground system, though what purpose such a hydraulic system might serve remains unclear. And they further claim that some of the radar signatures suggest artificial construction rather than natural geological features, based on the regularity and symmetry of the structures and their apparent alignment with the pyramid above. The problem with these claims, and the reason so many mainstream Egyptologists have expressed skepticism or outright rejection, is that SAR imaging is notoriously difficult to interpret, especially when applied to archaeological contexts, because the technique was originally developed for monitoring ground deformation and infrastructure stability, not for detecting ancient underground structures, and there are many geological and environmental factors that can create radar signatures similar to what the researchers are interpreting as artificial shafts, including natural limestone cavities, which are common in the Giza Formation, differences in rock density and composition, groundwater movement, temperature variations, and even the effects of the pyramid's enormous weight compressing the bedrock beneath it, all of which can cause the kinds of micro-movements that SAR detects. Dr. Mark Lehner, one of the world's foremost authorities on Giza, who has spent decades excavating and mapping the plateau, has pointed out that without direct excavation, or at minimum some kind of ground-penetrating confirmation using different technologies, the SAR images remain speculative, interesting data that warrants further investigation, but not proof of massive underground structures. And he and other critics have noted that if such deep shafts truly exist, we would expect to see evidence of the enormous amount of debris that would have been generated in their excavation, millions of tons of limestone that would have to have been removed and deposited somewhere, yet there is no evidence of debris mounds or quarry sites on the scale that would be necessary, and additionally, the engineering challenges of excavating shafts more than 600 meters deep using only ancient tools would have been staggering, perhaps even impossible, making many researchers doubt that such structures could exist. However, and this is where the story becomes more nuanced, the fact that we have skepticism about the interpretation does not mean the data itself is worthless, and several independent researchers have pointed out that the SAR scans do show anomalies beneath the pyramid, structures or features that warrant investigation, even if they are not the massive shaft systems that Capasso and Henderson claim. And there is a growing consensus that the area beneath Khafre's pyramid and the broader Giza plateau probably does contain undiscovered underground features, whether natural or artificial, that could significantly enhance our understanding of the site. And the question is not whether we should investigate further, but how we can do so in a way that is both scientifically rigorous and respectful of the monuments themselves. This brings us back to the confirmed discoveries. The structures we know exist because they have been physically accessed and documented, and chief among these is the remarkable network of shafts and chambers around the Osiris tomb complex. Because while the Osiris Shaft itself has been known since the 1992, recent investigations have revealed that it is part of a larger system of underground features extending across the causeway area between Khafre's pyramid and the Sphinx, suggesting that the ancient Egyptians created an entire subterranean landscape beneath this part of the plateau, And understanding the purpose of this landscape requires us to delve deeper into Egyptian funerary theology and the specific rituals associated with royal burials during the Old Kingdom period. The Osiris Shaft gets its name from its apparent connection to the Osiris myth, the story of the god who was killed by his brother Set, dismembered, and scattered across Egypt, only to be reassembled by his wife Isis and resurrected as the lord of the afterlife. And this myth was central to Egyptian concepts of death and rebirth, because it established that death was not an ending but a transformation, that through proper ritual and preparation, the deceased could follow Osiris's path from death to eternal life, and the flooded chamber at the bottom of the shaft, with its island-like platform supporting a massive sarcophagus surrounded by water, recreates the mythological geography of Osiris's resurrection, the primordial mound emerging from the waters of chaos. And standing in that chamber, as the few archaeologists who have descended into it can attest, you feel the weight of theological intention. This is not merely a tomb or a storage chamber, but a sacred space designed to channel spiritual power and facilitate transformation. Dr. Hawass, who led the excavation and study of the Osiris Shaft, has suggested that it might have been used for specific rituals related to the pharaoh's resurrection, possibly ceremonies that took place after the pharaoh's death but before or during the burial process, because ancient texts describe complex funerary rituals that sometimes took 70 days to complete, involving multiple stages of mummification, ritual purification, and magical ceremonies. And some of these rituals might have required access to underground spaces that symbolically represented the underworld, spaces where priests could perform the necessary rites to ensure the pharaoh's successful transition to the afterlife. And if this interpretation is correct, then the Osiris Shaft and potentially other underground chambers at Giza were not tombs in the conventional sense, but ritual spaces, magical engines designed to harness the power of sacred geography and transform the deceased into an immortal being. This would explain why some of the underground features at Giza appear unfinished or empty, why they lack the decoration and burial goods we would expect in a tomb, because they were not designed to house bodies permanently, but to serve as temporary ritual spaces, places where transformative ceremonies could be performed and then abandoned, their purpose fulfilled once the pharaoh has successfully navigated the underworld and achieved resurrection. And this interpretation also aligns with the broader pattern we see in Egyptian funerary architecture, where the visible monuments, the pyramids, and temples represent only one layer of meaning, while beneath them lies a hidden layer, a secret geography accessible only to priests and the dead, where the actual magical work of resurrection takes place. The discovery in May 2024 of previously unknown underground structures in the Western Cemetery near the Great Pyramid adds another dimension to our understanding, because using a combination of electrical resistivity, tomography, and ground-penetrating radar, researchers identified two large anomalies beneath the cemetery, structures that appear to be artificial chambers or passages connecting to the pyramid complex. And while these features have not yet been excavated, the initial scans suggest they are substantial, possibly 20 or more meters in length, and located at a depth of approximately 8 meters below the current ground surface, making them contemporary with or older than the surface tombs above them. And the fact that they appear to connect toward the pyramid suggests they might be part of an underground network linking different parts of the royal necropolis, creating a hidden map beneath the visible landscape, a map that perhaps mirrors the geography of the Duat itself, with the pyramid at its center representing the axis mundi, the cosmic center where heaven, earth, and underworld meet. When we step back and look at the totality of what we know and what we are discovering about the underground structures at Giza, a picture emerges of a site far more complex and carefully planned than we had previously imagined, because we are not looking at random subterranean features added haphazardly over the centuries, but rather an integrated system of above ground and below ground architecture where what you see on the surface, the pyramids, temples, causeways, and tombs, represents only half the story, while beneath lies a mirror world, a negative space carved from rock instead of built with stone, descending into darkness instead of rising toward the light. Yet equally important to the overall purpose of the site, which was not simply to bury dead kings, but to facilitate their transformation into gods and ensure the cosmic order continued unbroken, generation after generation. The pyramid texts, the oldest religious writings in the world, inscribed on the walls of pyramids beginning in the late 5th dynasty, describe the deceased pharaoh's journey through the underworld in vivid detail. Speaking of passages and chambers, lakes and rivers, gates guarded by fierce entities, and transformations that the soul must undergo. And while these texts are often interpreted as purely mythological, describing a spiritual rather than physical geography, the increasing evidence of elaborate underground structures at Giza raises an intriguing question. What if the texts are describing both metaphysical and physical spaces? What if the underground chambers and passages beneath the pyramids were designed to match the geography described in the texts, creating a physical template that the deceased pharaoh would navigate after death, following a route through actual tunnels and chambers that corresponded to his metaphysical journey through the Duat? And if this is true, then mapping the underground structures of Giza becomes not just an archaeological exercise, but a way of reading the ancient Egyptian conception of the afterlife, written in stone and empty space beneath the desert. Consider the famous spell 148 from the pyramid texts, which describes 7 gates through which the deceased must pass, each guarded by a different entity, and each requiring specific knowledge to open. And then consider that the Osiris Shaft has 7 distinct chambers when you count all 3 levels and their subdivisions. 7 spaces through which one must pass to reach the final flooded chamber at the bottom. And while this could be coincidence, it could also represent intentional design, the architects of the shaft, creating a physical manifestation of the mythological journey. And if we had complete access to all the underground features of Giza, if we could map every passage and chamber and shaft, would we find that they correspond to the mythological geography described in the texts? Would we discover that beneath the plateau lies a stone codex, a 3-dimensional manuscript describing the path to resurrection that every pharaoh was expected to follow? The third pyramid at Giza, belonging to Pharaoh Menkaure and the smallest of the 3 main pyramids, has recently revealed its own underground secrets, because in November 2025, the ScanPyramids team announced that they had detected air-filled anomalies behind the eastern facade of the pyramid, voids that might indicate a previously unknown entrance or internal chamber system. And these findings are particularly significant because Menkaure's pyramid has been less studied than its larger neighbors, and the discovery suggests that it too might contain hidden passages and chambers that could reshape our understanding of its design and purpose. And electrical resistivity tomography scans have revealed what appear to be 2 distinct void spaces, one approximately 4 meters long and another slightly smaller, both located behind the pyramid's original casing stones at a height of about 12 meters above the base. And while the purpose and extent of these voids remains unknown pending further investigation, they demonstrate once again that even the most studied monuments in the world continue to surprise us, continue to reveal that our knowledge is incomplete, and that beneath and within these ancient structures lie secrets we have yet to uncover. What makes these recent discoveries particularly exciting is not just that they reveal new chambers and passages, but that they are forcing archaeologists and Egyptologists to reconsider fundamental assumptions about how the pyramids were designed and what they were meant to accomplish. Because the traditional model, which sees the pyramids primarily as elaborate tombs, elegant solutions to the problem of housing and protecting the pharaoh's mummified body for eternity, begins to seem inadequate when we consider the complexity of the underground architecture, the careful integration of water features, the apparent encoding of mythological geography into physical space, and the sheer scale of the effort invested in creating features that were designed to be hidden, to be inaccessible, to exist in permanent darkness beneath the stone and sand. Some researchers have proposed that we need to think of the pyramid complex not as a building, but as a machine, a precisely engineered system designed to accomplish something specific. And while we might debate what that something is, whether it is facilitating the pharaoh's resurrection, maintaining cosmic order, serving as an astronomical observatory, or something we have not yet imagined, the machine metaphor is useful because it emphasizes that every element of the complex, from the massive limestone blocks stacked hundreds of feet in the air to the hidden passages carved deep beneath the bedrock, serves a purpose. contributes to the overall function of the system, and understanding that function requires us to map and analyze not just the visible components, but the hidden ones as well. The underground chambers and passages that represent the machine's secret workings, the mechanisms hidden beneath the surface that make the whole system operate. This perspective becomes even more compelling when we consider the precision with which the pyramids were constructed, because the Great Pyramid is aligned to true north with an accuracy of better than 4 arc minutes, roughly 1/15 of a degree, an achievement that would be impressive with modern surveying equipment, but borders on miraculous for a culture working with copper tools and no magnetic compass. And the pyramid's base is leveled to within 2 centimeters across its more than 200-meter width, and the 4 sides of the base are equal in length to within a few centimeters. And these precision measurements are not limited to the external structure, but extend to the internal passages and chambers as well, with the ascending passage maintaining its 26-degree angle for more than 40 meters without deviation, and the Grand Gallery, that soaring corbelled passage that climbs toward the king's chamber, constructed with such precision that the blocks fit together without mortar yet remain stable after more than 4 millennia. And if the builders invested this level of precision in the elements we can see and measure, it stands to reason that the underground features, the subterranean chambers and passages, were constructed with similar care and accuracy, serving specific functions that required exact dimensions and orientations. The role of water in the underground architecture deserves deeper examination, because water appears again and again in association with subterranean features at Giza, not just in the deliberately flooded Osiris Shaft, but in other contexts as well. And geologists studying the subterranean chamber of the Great Pyramid have found evidence of water damage on the walls and floor, suggesting that at some point in the chamber's history it held water, either from seasonal flooding as the water table rose and fell, or from deliberate introduction. And chemical analysis of mineral deposits in the chamber has revealed compounds consistent with Nile water, indicating that the water that once filled or partially filled this chamber came from the river rather than from groundwater alone. And this raises fascinating questions about how the ancient builders might have channeled water from the Nile, which even in antiquity was several hundred meters away from the pyramid, into chambers deep beneath the structure. Dr. Chris Massey, a hydrological engineer who has studied ancient water management systems, has proposed that the causeway connecting the pyramid to its valley temple might have served a dual purpose, functioning not only as a ceremonial pathway for processions, but also as a conduit for water, because the causeway was roofed and enclosed, creating a tunnel-like structure. And if there were channels or pipes running beneath or alongside the ceremonial walkway, water could have been brought from the Nile to the pyramid complex, and from there distributed to various underground chambers, filling them at specific times for specific rituals. And while we have no direct evidence of such a water distribution system, the fact that multiple underground chambers show signs of having contained water, combined with the theological importance of water in funerary rituals, makes the hypothesis worth considering. An archaeological investigation of the causeway foundations might reveal evidence of channels or pipes that could confirm this theory. The legends and traditions surrounding the Giza Plateau speak repeatedly of hidden chambers containing ancient knowledge, lost treasures, or powerful artifacts. And while most of these stories are apocryphal, invented in later periods, or elaborated from fragments of genuine tradition, they are nonetheless worth examining because they sometimes preserve kernels of truth about features that existed but have since been lost, forgotten, or sealed. And one of the most persistent of these legends concerns the Hall of Records, supposedly a chamber containing the accumulated wisdom of a lost civilization. And this legend has been traced to various sources, including the writings of the prophet Edgar Cayce in the early 20th century, but it also appears in much older traditions, including Islamic texts from medieval Egypt that speak of underground chambers beneath the pyramids containing books and treasures from before the flood. And while we should be deeply skeptical of such claims, particularly when they are connected to ideas about lost civilizations with advanced technology, it is worth noting that the ancient Egyptians did create archive rooms and library chambers in some of their temple complexes, repositories where papyri and important records were stored. And while no such repository has been found at Giza, The possibility that underground chambers might have served archival or storage functions, particularly for ritual objects and texts needed for funerary ceremonies, cannot be entirely dismissed. And if such chambers exist and remain undiscovered, they would be of immense archaeological value, potentially containing organic materials, papyri, wooden objects, fabrics, that would normally decay in Egypt's climate but might be preserved in the stable temperature and humidity of a sealed underground chamber. In May 2024, the discovery of two anomalous structures in the Western Cemetery sent ripples through the archaeological community precisely because they appeared to be artificial chambers at a depth and location that suggested they might predate or be contemporary with the earliest pyramid construction. And Dr. Yukinori Kawai, the Japanese geophysicist who led the scanning effort, described the anomalies as showing clear right-angle features, straight walls, and corners that could not be natural geological formations. And while the team has not yet received permission to excavate and confirm what the scans show, they have proposed that the structures might be part of a network of underground passages connecting the various royal tombs in the cemetery to the pyramid itself, creating a hidden necropolis beneath the visible one. And if this is confirmed, it would represent a major shift in our understanding of Giza's layout and purpose, suggesting that the entire Western Cemetery, which contains dozens of mastaba tombs belonging to Khufu's relatives and high officials, is connected underground, creating a subterranean city of the dead beneath the sand, a hidden counterpart to the city of the living that once bustled around the pyramid complex. The concept of a hidden underground network is not without precedent in Egyptian archaeology, because at Saqqara, the necropolis south of Giza that contains the famous step pyramid of Djoser, archaeologists have discovered extensive underground galleries containing thousands of mummified animals, primarily ibises and baboons, that were offered to the god Thoth, and these galleries extend for kilometers beneath the desert, forming a vast catacomb system that was only partially known until modern mapping efforts revealed its true extent. And if such massive underground constructions exist at Saqqara, created during the same general period as the Giza pyramids, then similar networks at Giza become more plausible, and we must consider that what we have discovered so far, the Osiris Shaft, the subterranean chamber, the various passages and pits, might represent only the most obvious features of a much larger underground complex that remains hidden because we have not yet found the entrances or because the passages have collapsed or been deliberately sealed. The question of deliberate sealing is particularly intriguing because we have evidence that some underground features at Giza were intentionally closed off in antiquity, filled with rubble or blocked with stone plugs that would have required significant effort to install, suggesting that whatever lay beyond was considered either dangerous, sacred, or valuable enough to warrant permanent closure. And the 3 granite plugs that once blocked the ascending passage in the Great Pyramid, huge precisely cut blocks that were slid into place after the pharaoh's burial, are the most famous example of this sealing behavior. But they are not the only one, because the subterranean chamber beneath Khafre's pyramid shows evidence of having had its entrance blocked at some point, and several of the shafts in the Western Cemetery appear to have been deliberately filled. And this pattern of sealing suggests that the ancient Egyptians wanted certain underground spaces to remain inaccessible, wanted to ensure that what lay within would never be disturbed. And understanding why requires us to think about Egyptian attitudes toward the dead and the underworld, because these were not simply superstitious fears but theological convictions. The underworld was a real place, as real as the visible world, and it needed to be properly separated from the realm of the living, with boundaries and barriers that ensured the two realms did not intermix inappropriately. The modern exploration of underground Giza presents enormous technical challenges, because unlike excavating a surface structure where you can bring in heavy equipment, create access roads, and work in daylight, investigating underground features requires specialized equipment and expertise, and every meter you descend introduces new complications, the need for artificial lighting, ventilation systems to provide breathable air, structural support to prevent collapse, and methods to remove water if passages are flooded. And these challenges are compounded by the fact that we are working in an active archaeological site where preservation is paramount, where we cannot simply blast through obstacles or bulldoze our way forward, but must proceed with painstaking care, documenting everything, preserving context, ensuring that our investigation does not destroy the very evidence we seek to uncover. Dr. Sarah Chen, whom we met at the beginning of this narrative, has been pioneering new approaches to underground exploration that combine robotic technology with traditional archaeological methods, using small, remotely operated vehicles equipped with cameras, sensors, and sampling equipment that can be sent into passages too narrow, too unstable, or too dangerous for human explorers. And her team has successfully mapped several previously inaccessible tunnels in the pyramid complex, discovering features that would have remained unknown if human entry were required, including a narrow passage extending from the subterranean chamber that appears to angle deeper into the bedrock but becomes too constricted after about 15 meters to allow the robot to proceed further, leaving us tantalized by the question of where it leads and what might lie at its end. The use of LIDAR technology, which creates three-dimensional maps using laser pulses, has revolutionized our ability to understand the complex underground topography of Giza, because unlike traditional surveying, which requires direct access and sightlines, LIDAR can map spaces in darkness, can create detailed models of passages and chambers that can then be analyzed and studied without repeated visits to the underground sites, and a comprehensive LIDAR survey of all accessible underground features at Giza, which is currently underway as a collaborative project between Egyptian authorities and international research institutions, promises to provide us with the most complete understanding yet of what exists beneath the pyramids. And when this survey is complete, researchers will be able to create virtual reality environments that allow anyone to explore the underground chambers, to walk through the Osiris Shaft, or descend into the subterranean chamber from the safety and comfort of their computer, democratizing access to spaces that are currently restricted to a handful of specialists. But technology can only take us so far, and ultimately, understanding what lies beneath the pyramids requires more than just mapping the spaces. It requires interpreting them, understanding why they were created, what functions they served, and how they fit into the broader religious and cultural context of ancient Egypt. And this is where archaeology must partner with Egyptology, anthropology, religious studies, and other humanistic disciplines, because a three-dimensional map of an underground chamber tells us its dimensions but not its purpose, shows us its physical reality but not its symbolic meaning. And to truly understand these spaces, we must read the ancient texts, study the religious iconography, examine parallels from other sites, and think deeply about what these underground realms meant to the people who created them. One of the most fascinating recent insights comes from comparing the underground features at Giza with similar structures from later periods, particularly the royal tombs of the New Kingdom in the Valley of the Kings, because while these tombs were created more than 1,000 years after the Giza pyramids, they share certain features that suggest continuity in Egyptian funerary theology. The tombs in the Valley of the Kings are essentially elaborate underground corridors and chambers cut deep into the rock, descending in some cases more than 100 meters below the surface, and they are decorated with scenes and text from the Book of the Dead, the Duat, and other funerary literature that describe the underworld journey. And when you compare the layout of these tombs with what we know of the underground structures at Giza, patterns emerge. Both feature descending passages leading to chambers at various levels. Both incorporate shafts and side passages whose purposes are not always clear. Both show evidence of water-related features or symbolism. And both appear designed to guide or facilitate the deceased's journey through the underworld, suggesting that despite the 1,000-year gap, the underlying theological concepts remained remarkably consistent. This continuity is significant because it suggests that the underground structures at Giza were not experimental one-offs, but part of a long tradition of Egyptian funerary architecture, a tradition that would evolve and develop over millennia, but would maintain certain core features and purposes. And if we can understand the later, better documented examples, we can work backwards to infer things about the earlier, more mysterious ones, using our knowledge of New Kingdom tomb design and theology to illuminate the puzzles of Old Kingdom underground architecture. And this comparative approach has already yielded insights. For example, the deep pit in the subterranean chamber, long dismissed as unfinished or purposeless, matches features found in later tombs where such pits clearly served ritual functions. containing offerings or representing entrances to even deeper metaphysical realms, suggesting that the Giza pit was likewise intentional and meaningful rather than simply abandoned. The role of astronomy in pyramid design and orientation is well established, with numerous scholars demonstrating that the pyramids align with celestial phenomena. The southern shaft from the King's Chamber in the Great Pyramid points toward Orion, the constellation associated with Osiris, while the northern shaft points toward the circumpolar stars that never set, representing eternal life. And these astronomical alignments are not incidental but fundamental to the pyramid's purpose, connecting the earthly structure to the cosmic order. But what is less often discussed is how the underground chi H ambers might also relate to astronomical or celestial symbolism. Because if the pyramid as a whole is a cosmogram, a three-dimensional representation of the universe, then the underground portions represent the cosmic underworld. And just as the above-ground shafts connect to specific stars, the underground passages might connect to or represent other celestial features, perhaps the Milky Way, which the Egyptians saw as a celestial river corresponding to the earthly Nile, or perhaps other constellations associated with the underworld deities. And exploring these potential astronomical connections requires us to consider not just where the underground passages point, but when they would have pointed there, because the Earth's axis precesses over a roughly 26,000-year cycle, meaning that the stars visible at any given location change slowly over centuries, and a passage that pointed to a particular star in 2500 BCE would point somewhere different today. And calculating these ancient alignments requires sophisticated archaeoastronomy software and careful measurement, but the results could reveal that the underground architecture is as carefully aligned with the cosmos as the visible structure, encoding astronomical knowledge into the very rock beneath the pyramid. Recent work by Dr. Giulio Magli, an archaeoastronomer at Politecnico di Milano, has suggested that the descending passage of the Great Pyramid might have been aligned with a specific star, possibly Thuban in the constellation Draco, which served as the pole star during the Old Kingdom. And if you stood at the bottom of the descending passage and looked up toward the entrance on a particular night of the year, you would see this star framed in the passage opening, creating a visual connection between the deep underground chamber and the highest point in the heavens, between the underworld and the celestial realm. And this kind of alignment is precisely what we would expect if the pyramid was designed as a resurrection machine, a device to facilitate the pharaoh's journey from death to eternal life by linking earth, underworld, and heaven into a unified system. The question of what else might be discovered beneath Giza remains one of the most exciting prospects in archaeology, because despite more than a century of excavation and study, despite the application of increasingly sophisticated scanning and imaging technologies, we can be confident that significant features remain hidden. And the history of archaeology at Giza is a history of surprises, of discoveries that overturned previous assumptions, and there is no reason to think we have reached the end of that process. Indeed, the recent discoveries of voids in the pyramids themselves and anomalies in the surrounding plateau suggest we may be entering a new era of discovery, where technologies that did not exist even a decade ago allow us to see through stone and sand to reveal features that have been hidden for millennia. In October 2025, a team from the University of Cairo announced that they had identified what appeared to be additional anomalous structures in the area between the Great Pyramid and the Sphinx, using a new type of quantum gravimetry sensor, a device that measures minute variations in the Earth's gravitational field that might indicate underground voids. And while this technology is still experimental and the results require verification, the initial scans show several areas where the gravitational readings are inconsistent with solid limestone, suggesting either natural cavities or artificial chambers. And the locations of these anomalies are tantalizing, clustered around the causeway and seemingly aligned with known underground features like the Osiris Shaft, raising the possibility that they are connected, that they form part of a larger system that we have only begun to uncover. If we allow ourselves to imagine what might exist in these undiscovered spaces, what might be found if and when they are finally accessed, the possibilities are extraordinary, because any sealed chamber that has remained untouched since antiquity has the potential to preserve materials and artifacts that would normally decay, papyri containing unknown texts, wooden statues and furniture, fabrics and organic materials, all preserved in the stable environment of an underground chamber. And even more valuable than physical artifacts would be the information that undiscovered chambers could provide about pyramid construction, funerary practices, religious beliefs, and the organization of Old Kingdom society. Because every new chamber is a new archive, a new source of evidence that can answer questions or raise new ones, and the dream of every archaeologist working at Giza is to discover that one chamber, that one sealed space that contains something truly revolutionary, whether it is a complete library of papyri, a fully equipped burial, or simply a room with intact wall decorations that can tell us what these underground spaces meant to their creators. But we must balance excitement about potential discoveries with realistic assessment of what is likely versus what is possible, because the field of pyramid studies has been plagued by sensationalist claims and pseudoscientific theories, from assertions that the pyramids were built by aliens to claims that they functioned as power plants or communication devices. And while these ideas make for entertaining speculation, they lack evidentiary support and distract from the genuine mysteries and achievements that archaeology continues to uncover. And the real story of what lies beneath the pyramids is fascinating enough without embellishment, a story of human ingenuity and theological sophistication, of engineering prowess and artistic achievement, of a civilization that invested extraordinary resources into creating monuments that would connect the human and divine realms, ensuring cosmic stability and offering their kings a path to immortality. The workers who carved these underground chambers faced challenges we can barely imagine, working in darkness illuminated only by oil lamps or torches, breathing air that must have been thick with stone dust, pounding copper chisels into stubborn limestone for hours each day, removing the debris basket by basket through narrow passages to the surface, and yet they achieved precision that rivals modern construction, creating level floors, straight walls, accurate angles, all while working dozens of meters beneath the ground with no power tools, no electric lights, no mechanical ventilation. And understanding how they accomplished this requires us to reconstruct not just their tools and techniques, but their organizational systems, the logistics of managing work crews in confined underground spaces, the methods of ensuring quality control when the work is hidden from direct supervision, the solutions to problems of air circulation and illumination, and debris removal that must have arisen daily during construction. Dr. Dennis Stocks, an experimental archaeologist who has spent years reconstructing ancient Egyptian tools and techniques, has demonstrated through practical experiments that copper tools, when properly designed and maintained, can effectively cut limestone, especially when used with quartz sand as an abrasive. And his work has shown that ancient construction techniques, while labor-intensive and time-consuming, were entirely capable of producing the precision we see in the pyramids and their underground chambers. And this is important because it grounds our understanding in practical reality rather than mysticism, showing us that what lies beneath the pyramids is the product of human effort and intelligence, remarkable but not supernatural. And this makes it more impressive, not less, because it demonstrates what human societies can accomplish when they mobilize resources and expertise toward a common goal. The social organization required to build the pyramids and excavate their underground chambers tells us much about Old Kingdom Egypt, because these were not projects that could be accomplished by slave labor driven by whips, as old Hollywood films depicted, but required skilled workers, trained engineers, competent administrators, and effective logistics. And archaeological evidence from the workers' village at Giza shows that the pyramid builders were well fed, housed in purpose-built accommodations, and received medical care when injured, suggesting they were valued members of society participating in what they understood as sacred work, not oppressed slaves, but participants in a national project of cosmic importance. And this changes how we think about the underground chambers, because if the workers understood their labor as sacred, as helping to ensure the pharaoh's resurrection and thereby maintaining cosmic order, then the precision and care evident in these hidden spaces makes sense. They were not cutting corners on work that would never be seen, but investing their best efforts in creating spaces that would function in the afterlife, that would serve purposes beyond the merely physical. The relationship between the above ground and below ground elements of the pyramid complex reflects Egyptian concepts of duality, the visible and the hidden, the upper and the lower, light and darkness, life and death. And just as their theology emphasized the necessity of both elements, the pyramid architecture integrates them into a unified whole, and you cannot understand the pyramid by looking only at what is visible above ground, because the underground portions are not optional add-ons but essential components of the overall design. And similarly, the underground features make no sense in isolation but must be understood in relation to the towering mass of stone above them. And this integration of opposites, this unity of visible and hidden, is characteristically Egyptian, reflecting a worldview that saw reality as composed of complementary pairs that together created wholeness and balance. When we consider what the ancient Egyptians believed happened after death, the importance of the underground chambers becomes clearer, because death was not seen as the end of existence, but as a dangerous transition period during which the deceased had to navigate the Duat, overcome various obstacles and enemies, be judged by Osiris and the 42 divine assessors, and ultimately be reborn as an immortal being. And this process was understood as taking place in real locations, not just metaphorical or spiritual spaces, and the pyramid complex, with its above ground and underground elements, provided a physical map of this journey, the descending passage representing the descent into the underworld, the subterranean chamber representing the deepest point of that descent, the ascending passage representing the beginning of resurrection, and the upper chambers representing the final transformation into immortality. And if this interpretation is correct, then every architectural element has meaning, every passage and chamber corresponds to a stage in the resurrection process, and the entire complex functions as a machine designed to facilitate and ensure the pharaoh's successful transformation. The discovery of the lost labyrinth mentioned by Herodotus has been a goal of archaeologists for more than a century, because Herodotus described a massive underground complex near Lake Moeris, far south of Giza, containing 3,000 rooms spread across 2 levels, one above ground and one below, and he claimed it surpassed even the pyramids in its magnificence. And while this structure has been tentatively identified with the ruins near the pyramid of Amenemhat III at Hawara, much of it, particularly the underground portions, remains unexcavated, and some researchers have speculated that similar labyrinthine structures might exist at Giza, hidden beneath the sand or accessible through passages we have not yet found. And while we should be cautious about such speculation, the fact that Herodotus was describing real features at Hawara, even if he exaggerated their extent, suggests that large underground complexes were within the capabilities of ancient Egyptian engineers. And if such structures exist at Giza, they might explain some of the anomalies that scanning technologies have detected, clusters of voids and passages that seem to form networks rather than isolated features. The role of sound and acoustics in the underground chambers is an area of recent research that has yielded surprising insights, because several researchers have noted that certain chambers, particularly the King's Chamber in the Great Pyramid, have unusual acoustic properties, with specific resonant frequencies that can create powerful sonic effects. And while this has led to various speculative theories about the pyramids being designed as sonic healing chambers or resonance devices, the more prosaic explanation is that the acoustic properties, whether intentional or accidental, might have been used in rituals, because sound played an important role in Egyptian religious ceremonies, with priests chanting, singing, and playing musical instruments as part of their rites. And a chamber with strong resonance would amplify these sounds, creating an impressive and otherworldly atmosphere that would enhance the ritual's power and meaning. And testing the acoustic properties of underground chambers, particularly those like the Osiris Shaft that we know were used for ceremonies, might reveal that they too were designed with sound in mind, that their dimensions and shapes were calculated not just for structural or symbolic reasons, but to create specific acoustic effects that would enhance their ritual function. Dr. Robert Schock has conducted extensive research on weathering patterns in the underground chambers, and his findings suggest that some of the chambers, particularly the subterranean chamber, show evidence of water erosion that predates the pyramid's construction, implying that natural cavities in the limestone might have existed before the builders began their work, and these pre-existing features might have influenced where and how the underground chambers were constructed, with the builders incorporating natural formations into their design rather than creating everything from scratch. And this would explain some of the irregularities in the subterranean chamber, the rough surfaces and uneven features that do not match the precision seen elsewhere. These might be natural rock surfaces that the builders chose to leave unchanged because they serve the symbolic purpose of representing primordial chaos, the raw stone of creation before it was shaped by divine order. The environmental conditions within the underground chambers are remarkably stable, with temperature and humidity remaining nearly constant year-round, and this stability has important implications for preservation, because any organic materials that might be sealed in undiscovered chambers would have excellent chances of survival, protected from the temperature fluctuations and moisture changes that cause decay in most archaeological contexts. And this is why the prospect of finding sealed chambers is so exciting to researchers, because unlike surface tombs that have been exposed to the elements and often looted in antiquity, an intact underground chamber could preserve a snapshot of Old Kingdom material culture, showing us artifacts and materials exactly as they were left more than 4,000 years ago. And every sealed Egyptian tomb that has been opened, from Tutankhamun's to the recently discovered intact burials at Saqqara, has revealed objects and information that textbooks alone could never provide, and the potential for similar discoveries at Giza keeps researchers motivated despite the challenges and frustrations of working at such a heavily studied and closely regulated site. The political and bureaucratic challenges of conducting archaeological research at Giza sometimes rival the technical and scientific ones, because the site is not just an archaeological treasure, but a national symbol for Egypt, a source of tourism revenue, and a focus of pride and cultural identity. And any research project must navigate complex permissions, collaborate with Egyptian authorities and institutions, respect local interests and concerns, and operate within the framework of Egyptian antiquities law, which strictly regulates what can and cannot be done at protected sites. And this means that even when scanning technologies reveal promising anomalies or potential chambers, years might pass before permission is granted to investigate further, and proposals to drill or excavate must demonstrate compelling scientific justification and must guarantee that the monuments will not be damaged. And these restrictions, while sometimes frustrating to researchers eager to pursue new leads, serve important purposes, protecting the pyramids from exploitation, ensuring that Egyptian scholars and institutions are partners in any research rather than mere sources of access, and preventing the kind of treasure hunting mentality that characterized earlier periods of Egyptian archaeology, when foreign expeditions often treated the country's antiquities as resources to be extracted rather than heritage, to be preserved and studied. The ScanPyramids project represents a new model of international collaboration in Egyptian archaeology, bringing together Egyptian, French, Japanese, and Canadian institutions in a partnership where Egyptian researchers and authorities are fully involved in planning and decision-making rather than being consulted as an afterthought. And the project's commitment to using non-invasive techniques reflects a broader shift in archaeological method toward approaches that study monuments without damaging them, that gather information through observation and measurement rather than excavation and extraction. And while there will always be times when physical investigation is necessary, when you need to actually enter a chamber or take samples to confirm what scans suggest, the starting point is now to learn everything possible without disturbing the site, and only then, if justified, to proceed to more invasive methods. And this represents a maturation of the field, a recognition that these monuments are irreplaceable, and that our responsibility is to study them in ways that preserve them for future generations who might have even better tools and techniques than we possess today. The question of what to do when undiscovered chambers are confirmed is complex, because simply opening them and exposing them to air and light could begin processes of deterioration that would damage whatever is inside, and modern conservation techniques require careful control of environmental conditions when dealing with sealed spaces, gradually equalizing pressure and humidity, monitoring for dangerous gases or biological hazards, introducing light slowly to prevent shock to any organic materials, and documenting everything before anything is touched or moved. And this means that the discovery of a new chamber is not the end of the process, but the beginning of years of careful work to safely access, study, and preserve whatever it contains. And the public often does not appreciate this timeline, wanting immediate revelations and dramatic discoveries. But archaeology, done properly, is slow and meticulous, prioritizing preservation and documentation over speed and spectacle. The limestone from which the Giza Plateau is formed is itself millions of years old, deposited during the Eocene epoch when this area was covered by a warm, shallow sea, and the limestone contains fossils of marine organisms, nummulites, and other creatures that lived and died in that ancient ocean. And the pyramid builders were carving into this fossiliferous limestone, removing it block by block, and one wonders if they noticed the fossils, if they attributed any meaning to these strange shapes embedded in the rock, or if they simply saw them as natural patterns without deeper significance. And there is something profound about the fact that the chambers beneath the pyramids, created to house the dead and facilitate resurrection, are carved from stone that itself is a monument to death, composed of countless tiny marine organisms that died millions of years before humans existed, their bodies compressed and transformed into the very medium that later humans would use to build their own monuments to death and eternal life. And this layering of time, the deep geological time of the limestone formation, the historical time of pyramid construction, and the modern time of archaeological investigation, reminds us that these structures exist in multiple temporal frameworks simultaneously. They are ancient relics of a lost civilization, but they are also composed of matter that predates that civilization by incomprehensible spans of time, and they will likely endure far into the future, outlasting our own civilization just as they have outlasted the one that built them. When Dr. S. Arachen descended into the Osiris Shaft for the first time, equipped with diving gear because the lowest chamber is flooded, she described the experience as otherworldly. The narrow vertical descent through 3 levels of increasingly ancient architecture, the rough-hewn rock giving way to more finished surfaces and then back to rough stone, the temperature dropping as she went deeper, the darkness total beyond the reach of her lights, and then emerging into the flooded chamber, her light reflecting off black water, the massive sarcophagus visible on its island platform, silent and enigmatic, and she reported feeling a powerful sense of presence, not supernatural, but historical. The awareness that this space was created for purposes that transcended mere construction, that the hands that cut this rock and shaped this chamber were guided by beliefs and visions that we can only partially reconstruct, and that standing, or in her case floating in this space, connected her across 4.5 millennia to the people who created it. And these moments of connection, these experiential encounters with the ancient past, are part of what drives archaeologists to endure the heat and dust and bureaucracy and frustration. Because there are moments when the past stops being an abstraction and becomes almost tangibly present, when you touch the same stone that ancient hands shaped and feel, however briefly, a connection across the vast gulf of time. The comparative study of other pyramid sites throughout Egypt provides context for understanding what lies beneath Giza, because while Giza is the most famous pyramid complex, it is far from the only one, and pyramids were built throughout the Old and Middle Kingdoms, at sites like Saqqara, Dashur, Meidum, and Abu Rawash, and each of these sites has its own underground features, its own subterranean chambers and passages, and by studying the patterns across multiple sites, researchers can identify common elements that reflect shared theological concepts and distinguish site-specific features that might reflect particular historical circumstances or individual pharaohs' preferences. And this comparative approach has revealed that many pyramids have elaborate underground components, often more extensive than their above-ground chambers, suggesting that the underground realm was consistently viewed as essential to the pyramid's function, not an afterthought or optional feature, but a core element of the design. At Dashur, the bent pyramid of Sneferu, Khufu's father, contains 2 entirely separate entrance systems, leading to 2 different chambers, one access from the north face descending to a chamber beneath the pyramid's base, and another access from the west face leading to a chamber higher in the structure. And this unusual arrangement has puzzled researchers for decades, because it seems to represent either a change in plan during construction or a deliberate decision to create multiple pathways through the monument, and some scholars have suggested that this reflects an experimental phase in pyramid design, with Sneferu's architects testing different configurations before arriving at the more unified design used in Khufu's Great Pyramid. But another interpretation is that the dual chambers represent the two aspects of the resurrected pharaoh, the earthly body that remains in the lower tomb and the spiritual form that ascends to the upper chamber. And if this is correct, then the bent pyramid's underground features encode a theological concept that was later simplified in subsequent pyramids, but might still be present in subtler ways. The Red Pyramid, also built by Sneferu and located near the bent pyramid, features a long descending passage that leads to a series of 3 chambers, each with a corbelled ceiling similar to the Grand Gallery in the Great Pyramid. And the third and deepest chamber shows evidence of having been modified after initial construction, with additional passages and recesses cut into its walls. And these modifications suggest that the underground spaces were not simply built and forgotten, but were revisited, possibly used for ceremonies or rituals that required changes to the original design. And this pattern of modification and adaptation appears at other pyramid sites as well, indicating that the underground chambers were living spaces in the sense that they continued to be used and altered rather than being sealed forever once the pharaoh was buried. At Saqqara, the step pyramid of Djoser, the oldest of the major pyramids, sits atop an elaborate underground complex that includes more than 5 kilometers of passages, shafts, and chambers, carved into the bedrock and arranged in a maze-like configuration that has challenged modern archaeologists to map completely. And this underground city beneath the step pyramid includes storage galleries filled with thousands of stone vessels, chambers decorated with blue faience tiles meant to represent reed matting, and a series of false doors and sealed passageways that seem designed to confuse or deter intruders. And the sheer scale of this underground complex, far exceeding what would be necessary for a simple burial, suggests that it served multiple purposes, possibly including storage for funerary goods, workshops for ritual preparation, and chambers for ceremonies performed before and during the burial. And if the step pyramid, as the earliest example, already possessed such elaborate underground features, it seems likely that later pyramids maintained and perhaps exceeded this complexity, even if not all of their underground spaces have been discovered or fully explored. The recent application of artificial intelligence and machine learning to the analysis of scanning data from Giza has opened new possibilities for detecting underground features, because AI algorithms can identify patterns in radar or muon data that human researchers might miss, recognizing subtle correlations and anomalies that suggest the presence of voids or structures. And several teams are currently using neural networks trained on data from known chambers to predict where unknown chambers might exist, based on similarities in the scanning signatures. And while this approach is still experimental and its results require confirmation through other methods, early tests have been promising, with the AI correctly identifying the locations of known chambers when given incomplete data and suggesting the presence of previously unsuspected voids in areas that have not yet been thoroughly investigated. And if these AI-driven predictions prove accurate, they could dramatically accelerate the pace of discovery, allowing researchers to focus their efforts on the most promising locations, rather than scanning the entire plateau systematically. The ethics of archaeological investigation at sacred sites like Giza deserves careful consideration, because these monuments were created for religious purposes, were meant to be tombs and temples, places where the boundary between the human and divine realms could be crossed. And our modern archaeological curiosity, however scientifically motivated, involves violating spaces that were meant to be sealed, entering chambers that were designed to be forever inaccessible. And while we can justify this on the grounds of knowledge and historical understanding, we should not do so lightly or without acknowledging that there is a tension between our desire to know and the original purpose of these spaces. And this is why many archaeologists approach underground chambers with a sense of reverence, not religious necessarily, but respectful, acknowledging that they are entering spaces freighted with meaning and intention, even if we do not share the beliefs that created them. The phenomenon of tomb robbing in ancient Egypt complicates our understanding of what lies beneath the pyramids, because we know that most pyramids were robbed in antiquity, sometimes within decades or even years of their construction. And these ancient thieves were specifically targeting the underground chambers, breaking through the stone plugs that sealed the passages, navigating the darkness and dangers to reach the burial chambers and steal the valuable goods buried with the pharaoh. And in the process, they often damaged or destroyed evidence that would have been invaluable to modern archaeologists, smashing objects to remove gold leaf, scattering organic materials that have since decayed, and leaving behind a confusion of displaced artifacts that makes it difficult to determine what originally belonged where. And so when we explore underground chambers today, we are often seeing them in a state far removed from their original condition, and any conclusions we draw must account for this ancient disturbance, recognizing that the emptiness of chambers might reflect ancient robbery rather than original design, and that unusual features might be the result of robbers' excavations rather than the builder's intentions. Paradoxically, some of the most valuable information about what lies beneath the pyramids comes not from the chambers themselves, but from the passages that connect them, because these corridors reveal much about how the ancient builders conceived of movement through the monument, how they imagined the deceased pharaoh's journey from the entrance deep underground to the burial chamber high in the pyramid's core, and the changing angles and dimensions of these passages, the points where they branch or narrow or open into galleries. All of these features have symbolic and practical significance, and studying the geometry of the passage systems can reveal patterns and relationships that illuminate the overall design philosophy, showing us that what might appear as a simple corridor from point A to point B is actually a carefully calibrated sequence of spaces, each with its own character and purpose, and together creating a coherent narrative of descent, transformation, and ascent that maps the theology of death and resurrection onto physical space. The discovery in late 2025 by a team using electrical resistivity tomography of what appeared to be previously unknown passages extending from the area around the Sphinx has generated considerable excitement because the scan suggests corridors running beneath the causeway connecting the Sphinx to the Valley Temple. And if these passages exist and prove accessible, they could provide new insights into the relationship between the Sphinx and the pyramid complex. Because while the Sphinx has traditionally been studied somewhat separately from the pyramids, there is growing recognition that it was part of an integrated sacred landscape, and underground passages linking different elements of this landscape would confirm that the ancient designers conceived of the entire plateau as a unified complex rather than a collection of separate monuments. And this would require us to rethink our interpretations, to consider how the different elements might have worked together to create a larger symbolic system, with the Sphinx perhaps serving as a guardian or threshold marker for the underground realms accessed from the pyramid complex. The symbolism of direction in the underground chambers reflects Egyptian cosmology, because the Egyptians conceived of the universe as having distinct directional properties: east, where the sun rose, representing birth and renewal; west, where the sun set, representing death; north, associated with the circumpolar stars that never set and therefore with eternal life; and south, connected to the source of the Nile, and therefore with creation and abundance. And examining the underground chambers of the pyramids, we find that they are oriented with care to these cardinal directions: entrances typically facing north, descending passages angling toward the underworld, and chambers positioned in relation to the pyramid's center in ways that create geometric relationships with astronomical phenomena. And this careful orientation suggests that the builders understood the underground spaces not as random holes in the ground, but as precisely positioned components of a cosmic machine, with each chamber and passage occupying a specific place in a symbolic geography that mirrored and connected to the larger geography of the cosmos. The construction sequence of the underground chambers raises interesting questions about logistics and planning, because unlike the above-ground portions of the pyramid, which were built from the bottom up, layer by layer as the monument grew, the underground chambers had to be excavated before or during the early stages of pyramid construction, worked from the top down as shafts were sunk and passages carved into the bedrock. And this means that the builders had to have a clear and complete plan from the very beginning, had to know exactly where chambers would be located and how deep passages would descend. Because once you start carving into the rock, mistakes are difficult to correct. You cannot simply dismantle and rebuild as you might with stone blocks above ground, And the precision evident in the underground features therefore testifies to sophisticated planning, probably involving detailed drawings or models that specify dimensions and orientations before the first copper chisel struck stone. And while no such architectural plans have survived from the Old Kingdom, later Egyptian architectural drawings do exist, and they show remarkable sophistication in their use of grids, proportions, and geometric relationships, suggesting that similar methods were used for the pyramids. The role of groundwater in shaping and sometimes limiting the underground architecture is significant, because the water table beneath Giza, while lower today than in antiquity, still rises during certain seasons and can flood passages and chambers that descend below its level. And the builders would have been aware of this, would have had to plan their underground features with knowledge of where the water would be, which chambers could be flooded intentionally or would flood naturally, and which needed to remain dry. And this interaction with groundwater is particularly evident in structures like the Osiris Shaft, where the lowest level is permanently flooded, not because of modern water table rise, but because it was designed to be submerged, to recreate the primordial waters of Nun at the deepest point of the descent into the underworld. And other chambers show evidence of drainage systems, channels cut into floors to direct water away, or sump pits to collect water, indicating that the builders actively managed water rather than simply accepting where it would naturally accumulate. The relationship between the underground chambers and the external temple structures provides another layer of interpretation, because each pyramid at Giza was part of a larger complex that included a mortuary temple attached to the pyramid's east face, a causeway descending to the valley temple at the edge of the cultivated land, and various subsidiary structures including boat pits and smaller pyramids for queens. And these external elements are physically separated from the underground chambers, connected to them not by passages, but by symbolic and ritual relationships, yet they were conceived as parts of a unified whole. And understanding this requires us to think about how ancient Egyptians moved between different parts of the complex during funerary rituals, how processions would have wound from the valley temple up the causeway to the mortuary temple, how ceremonies might have been performed simultaneously at different locations, and how all of these activities related to what was happening or was believed to happen in the sealed chambers beneath and within the pyramid. Because the external temples were for the living, places where priests could perform daily rituals to maintain the deceased pharaoh's ka or spirit, while the underground chambers were for the dead, places that ideally would never be re-entered after the burial. And the pyramid structure itself mediated between these two realms, containing both while keeping them separate. The boat pits discovered around the pyramids provide an interesting parallel to the underground chambers, because like the subterranean spaces, these pits were carved into the bedrock and sealed, designed to be permanent and inaccessible. And they contained full-size wooden boats, ceremonial vessels that the pharaoh would supposedly use in the afterlife to travel with the sun god across the sky. And the fact that these boats were placed in sealed pits rather than in the pyramid itself suggests that the ancient Egyptians thought of the area around and beneath the pyramid as a single sacred space, with different elements serving different purposes, but all contributing to the same goal of ensuring the pharaoh's successful afterlife journey. And if we think about the underground chambers in this context, they become elements in a larger system of buried features, a network of sealed spaces beneath the plateau, each serving specific ritual or symbolic functions. And the challenge for modern archaeology is to map this entire network, to understand not just individual chambers, but how they relate to each other and to the above ground structures, creating a complete picture of the sacred geography of Giza. The inscriptions that do exist in some pyramid chambers, particularly the pyramid texts carved on the walls of later pyramids, provide crucial insights into the purpose and meaning of underground spaces, because these texts are not random collections of spells, but carefully organized programs of resurrection rituals, instructions for navigating the underworld, and declarations of the pharaoh's divine nature. And they describe the journey the deceased must take in vivid and sometimes terrifying detail, speaking of darkness and demons, of transformations and trials, of gates that must be opened and rivers that must be crossed. And reading these texts while standing in an underground chamber brings them to life in a new way, because you realize that these are not abstract theological speculations, but descriptions of the very space you occupy, that the darkness around you is the darkness the texts describe, that the passage you descended is the pathway through the underworld that the pharaoh's spirit would travel, and that the chamber itself is the destination, the place of transformation where death becomes new life. The recent use of environmental DNA sampling in pyramid chambers has opened unexpected avenues of research because ancient spaces can preserve DNA from organisms that once existed there, including humans, animals, plants, and microorganisms. And by carefully collecting and analyzing samples from the air, dust, and surfaces of underground chambers, researchers can potentially identify what living things were present during the pyramid's construction and use, including the workers who built the chambers, the priests who performed rituals there, any animals that might have been sacrificed or mummified, and even plants that might have been brought in as offerings. And this biological archaeology adds a new dimension to our understanding, providing information about who used these spaces and what they did there, information that traditional archaeology focused on stone and artifacts might miss, and early results from DNA sampling in the Osiris Shaft have identified human DNA from multiple individuals, suggesting that more than one person's remains were present in the chamber, which aligns with the archaeological evidence of multiple sarcophagi and supports the interpretation that this was a ritual space used over an extended period rather than a single-use tomb. The technological advances of the last decade have transformed pyramid studies from a field that relied primarily on physical exploration and excavation to one that can now employ a sophisticated arsenal of remote sensing, imaging, and analytical techniques. And this transformation has come none too soon, because the traditional approaches of drilling and excavating have limitations, both practical in that they are slow and expensive, and ethical in that they can damage the monuments being studied, and the new, non-invasive techniques allow us to learn about underground features without disturbing them, to map chambers and passages that we might never be able to physically enter, and to gather data that can be analyzed and reanalyzed as our interpretive frameworks evolve, creating permanent records that future researchers can mine for insights that we might not yet recognize as significant. The discovery patterns at Giza over the last century reveal an interesting trend, because the earlier discoveries were primarily of large, obvious features like the major chambers and passages within the pyramids themselves, things that could be found through physical exploration by simply following passages to see where they led. But more recent discoveries have been of subtler, more hidden features, voids detected by scanning that show no obvious entrance, chambers that might be sealed or accessible only through passages that are blocked or filled with debris, and anomalies that might represent natural features, ancient modifications, or something entirely unexpected. And this shift from finding the obvious to detecting the hidden suggests that we are entering a new phase of discovery, where the remaining unknowns are precisely those features that were meant to stay hidden, that were most carefully concealed, and therefore might be the most significant. Because if the ancient builders invested extraordinary effort in hiding something, that something was probably important, and the challenge now is to develop the technological and methodological tools to reveal these secrets without destroying them in the revelation. The question of whether all underground features at Giza have architectural functions or whether some might be natural geological features that the builders incorporated into their design is important, because the Giza Plateau is not a uniform block of limestone, but a complex geological formation with natural variations, faults, and cavities. And some of the voids and anomalies detected by scanning might be natural karstic features, caves and fissures created by water dissolving the limestone over millions of years. And if the ancient builders encountered such features during construction, they might have incorporated them into their plans, using natural caves as the basis for chambers, or deliberately sealing natural passages to prevent access to areas they wanted to keep secret. And distinguishing between artificial and natural features is not always easy, because ancient modifications might obscure the original character of a natural feature, or natural processes might have altered artificial features in ways that make them appear less regular than they originally were, and resolving these questions often requires direct investigation, actually entering the space and examining its walls and floor to see whether they show tool marks or whether they are natural rock surfaces. And until such direct examination is possible, we must remain open to multiple interpretations. The preservation conditions in underground chambers vary significantly depending on their depth, their connection to groundwater, and whether they have been opened to the outside air, because sealed chambers maintain stable temperature and humidity that can preserve organic materials for millennia, while chambers that have been opened experience fluctuations that accelerate decay. And some of the most exciting archaeological discoveries in Egypt have come from sealed contexts where preservation is extraordinary, including intact papyri, wooden objects with dye, our original paint, textiles that retain their colors, and even food offerings that, while desiccated, remain recognizable after thousands of years. And the dream of finding such preserved materials in a sealed chamber at Giza drives much of the current research, because a single well-preserved papyrus from an old kingdom context could tell us more about pyramid construction and the beliefs surrounding it than decades of studying the stones themselves. And while we must be realistic about the probability of finding major intact deposits given the extensive ancient disturbance and looting that occurred at Giza, the possibility cannot be ruled out entirely, and every new chamber discovered renews hope that somewhere beneath the plateau lies a space that the ancient robbers missed, a sealed room containing the kind of extraordinary finds that revolutionize our understanding. The interaction between modern tourism and archaeological research at Giza creates both opportunities and challenges, because the income from tourism helps fund research and conservation, providing resources that might not otherwise be available, but the presence of millions of visitors each year also creates pressures and constraints, limiting when and where excavations can take place, requiring that major monuments remain accessible rather than being closed for extended periods of study, and contributing to environmental stresses including vibrations from buses and crowds, humidity from breath and sweat, and physical wear from touching and climbing. And managing this balance between preservation, research, and public access requires careful planning and sometimes difficult choices about priorities. And the underground chambers, being less accessible to casual tourists, are somewhat protected from these pressures, but they are not immune, because even limited visitation can introduce moisture and biological contaminants, and deciding which spaces can be open to visitors and which must remain closed to protect their preservation is an ongoing challenge for site managers. The rediscovery of shafts that were known in the 19th century but subsequently lost provides a reminder of how much knowledge can be forgotten or obscured over time, because early explorers and archaeologists often documented features that were later covered by sand, blocked by construction, or simply forgotten as researchers' attention shifted to other areas. And modern teams using old maps and reports sometimes find references to passages or chambers that no longer appear on current site plans. And tracking down these lost features, determining whether they still exist, and if so, where they are located, has become a specialized area of archaeological research, combining historical detective work with modern scanning and excavation. And several of the anomalies detected by recent surveys might actually be rediscoveries of features that were known a century ago, but whose locations were imprecisely recorded or whose entrances have since been obscured. And confirming these rediscoveries requires careful comparison of old documentation with modern conditions, often revealing that what early explorers described in vague terms corresponds to specific detectable features that can now be studied with far greater precision than was possible in the past. The role of private funding in supporting pyramid research has increased in recent years as public funding for archaeology has become more competitive and restricted, and wealthy individuals and foundations interested in ancient Egypt have provided crucial support for scanning projects, excavations, and analytical studies that might not have been possible through traditional academic funding channels, but this reliance on private funding raises questions about control and access, because private funders may have expectations about publicity, may want exclusive rights to discoveries, or may prioritize spectacular finds over careful documentation. And ensuring that privately funded research maintains rigorous academic standards and makes its findings available to the broader scholarly community requires clear agreements and oversight, and most serious researchers and funders understand this and structure their collaborations accordingly. but the potential for conflicts between funding priorities and research integrity is something that must be actively managed, particularly in a field like Egyptian archaeology, where public interest is high and the temptation to sensationalize findings for publicity or fundraising purposes is ever present. The concept of landscape archaeology, which studies not just individual monuments but the relationships between monuments and their environmental and cultural contexts, has proven particularly valuable for understanding what lies beneath the pyramids, because the underground features are not isolated elements but parts of a larger sacred landscape that includes the visible monuments, the surrounding cemeteries, the workers' village, the harbors and causeways, and the natural features of the plateau itself. And mapping and analyzing this entire landscape reveals patterns and relationships that studying individual features in isolation would miss, showing how different elements were positioned relative to each other, how they were connected by sightlines and processional routes, how they related to astronomical phenomena and cardinal directions, and how they integrated natural features like the escarpment edge and wadi systems into the overall design. And this landscape approach suggests that beneath the plateau there may be an entire underground landscape as well, a network of passages, chambers, and shafts that mirrors and complements the visible landscape, creating a complete three-dimensional sacred geography where every element above and below ground, visible and hidden, contributes to the overall purpose of facilitating the pharaoh's transformation from mortal ruler to eternal god. The discovery of worked stone blocks in some underground chambers raises questions about whether these spaces were ever decorated, because while the major chambers we know were left with bare stone walls, undecorated except for the precision of their cutting, it is possible that other chambers, particularly those used for rituals rather than burial, might have had painted or relief carved decoration that has since been lost to decay or deliberate defacement, and traces of paint and plaster have been found in some contexts, suggesting that at least some underground surfaces were treated. Though whether this was structural, sealing the stone to prevent moisture infiltration, or decorative, providing images and text to guide and protect the deceased, remains unclear in many cases. And the complete absence of decoration in the major pyramid chambers at Giza contrasts sharply with later pyramids where walls are covered with pyramid texts, and this difference might reflect changing theological concepts, different views about whether the resurrection process required textual guidance, or whether the architecture itself, properly designed and oriented, was sufficient to ensure the desired transformation. The impact of earthquakes on underground structures is a concern that has received increasing attention, because Egypt, while not as seismically active as some regions, does experience periodic earthquakes, and the underground chambers, being carved from bedrock and often located at the junction between different geological layers, can be vulnerable to seismic stress, which might cause cracking, shifting, or collapse. And evidence from various sites shows that ancient structures have indeed been affected by earthquakes, with characteristic patterns of damage that can be distinguished from other types of deterioration. And assessing the seismic stability of known chambers and predicting how newly discovered chambers might respond to future earthquakes is important for both preservation and safety, because an unstable chamber poses risks not only to its own preservation, but potentially to the stability of the pyramid above it. And modern engineering analysis can model how underground voids affect the stress distribution within the monument, and whether interventions might be necessary to prevent catastrophic failure. The practice of creating false chambers and dead-end passages to confuse tomb robbers is well documented in Egyptian funerary architecture, and some of the seemingly incomplete or purposeless features at Giza might represent such deliberate deceptions created to protect the actual burial chamber by leading would-be robbers astray, and distinguishing between genuinely unfinished features, symbolic features that were never meant to be completed, and false features meant to deceive requires careful analysis of how the features were constructed, whether they show signs of use or subsequent modification, and how they relate to the overall architectural program. And in some cases, this analysis remains inconclusive, with different researchers offering different interpretations of the same feature. And these ongoing debates remind us that while we have learned much about what lies beneath the pyramids, fundamental questions about purpose and meaning remain contested and may never be fully resolved given the fragmentary nature of the evidence and the vast temporal and cultural distance separating us from the builders. The scientific debates about the controversial SAR findings underscore the importance of peer review and replication in archaeological research, because extraordinary claims must be subjected to rigorous scrutiny before being accepted, and the claims about massive underground structures extending hundreds of meters beneath Khafre's pyramid have generated exactly the kind of healthy skepticism that science requires, with multiple teams attempting to replicate the fin, dings using different technologies and methods. And this process of verification, while frustrating to those eager for definitive answers, is essential to ensuring that our understanding is built on solid evidence rather than misinterpreted data or wishful thinking. And as additional surveys are conducted and more data becomes available, we will either see the controversial findings confirmed, showing that beneath Giza lies something even more extraordinary than we imagined, or we will see them explained as misinterpretations of natural geological features or artifacts of the scanning process. And either outcome advances knowledge, because confirming extraordinary findings expands our understanding dramatically, while refuting them clarifies what the anomalies actually represent and prevents future researchers from being misled by similar data. The challenge of communicating archaeological findings to the public in ways that are both accurate and engaging is particularly acute when dealing with subjects like underground pyramid chambers, because the public appetite for mystery and discovery is enormous, and news media often sensationalize findings, turning tentative suggestions into dramatic revelations and possibilities into certainties. And researchers must navigate between the need to share their work and the risk that it will be misrepresented. And this is why many archaeologists are cautious about discussing preliminary findings or speculative interpretations publicly, preferring to wait until results are confirmed and peer-reviewed before making announcements. But this caution can be perceived as secrecy, fueling conspiracy theories and alternative narratives, and finding the right balance between scientific rigor and public transparency is an ongoing challenge that the field continues to grapple with. The application of photogrammetry and three-dimensional modeling to underground chambers has created detailed digital twins of these spaces, virtual replicas that capture every surface, contour, and spatial relationship with millimeter accuracy. And these digital models serve multiple purposes, providing permanent records that can be studied even if the physical spaces deteriorate or become inaccessible, allowing researchers to take measurements and test hypotheses without repeatedly visiting the actual chambers, enabling virtual reality experiences that can bring these hidden spaces to broader audiences, and creating baselines against which future conditions can be compared to detect any changes or deterioration over time. And as scanning technology becomes more sophisticated and affordable, the goal of completely documenting all accessible underground features at Giza in high-resolution three-dimensional models becomes increasingly achievable. And once created, these digital archives will be invaluable resources for future research, teaching, and public engagement. The question of what motivates modern exploration of what lies beneath the pyramids goes beyond simple curiosity, because these investigations engage with fundamental questions about human nature, about why we build monuments, what we believe about death and the afterlife, how we organize society to accomplish massive collective projects, and how cultures preserve and transmit knowledge across generations. And the ancient Egyptians' answers to these questions, encoded in the stones they carved and the spaces they created, offer perspectives different from our own modern Western viewpoints. And understanding their answers enriches our appreciation of human cultural diversity and challenges assumptions about what is natural or inevitable in human belief and behavior. And this is perhaps the deepest value of studying what lies beneath the pyramids. Not the specific facts about chamber dimensions or passage angles, important as those are, but the window these physical remains provide into radically different ways of thinking about existence, death, and immortality. The collaboration between Egyptologists, who understand the historical and cultural context, engineers, who understand structural mechanics and construction methods, geologists, who understand the bedrock and its properties, physicists, who develop and operate scanning technologies, and conservators, who ensure that investigations do not damage what they study, represents the kind of interdisciplinary approach that modern archaeology increasingly requires. because no single specialist can comprehend all aspects of something as complex as the underground chambers of Giza, and only by bringing together diverse expertise can we develop comprehensive understanding. And this collaborative approach also helps guard against the biases and blind spots that can affect any single discipline, because engineers thinking about structural efficiency might overlook ritual or symbolic concerns that are obvious to Egyptologists, while Egyptologists focused on religious texts might miss practical construction constraints that engineers immediately recognize. And the synthesis that emerges from genuine collaboration is richer and more nuanced than any single perspective could provide. The future of underground exploration at Giza likely involves increasingly sophisticated remote sensing that can detect and characterize features at greater depths and with higher resolution than current technologies allow, and several experimental techniques currently being tested, including cosmic ray muography with improved detectors, advanced ground-penetrating radar that can penetrate deeper into the bedrock, quantum gravimetry that can detect minute variations in gravitational field strength caused by underground voids, and acoustic tomography that uses sound waves to probe beneath the surface, promise to reveal features that remain invisible to current methods. And as these technologies mature and become more widely available, we can expect a new wave of discoveries that will further complicate and enrich our understanding of what lies beneath these ancient monuments. And each new discovery, each newly detected void or chamber or passage, generates new questions even as it answers old ones, ensuring that pyramid studies will remain a dynamic and evolving field for generations to come. The philosophical question of whether we should explore everything that can be explored or whether some spaces should be left undisturbed has occasionally been raised in discussions about pyramid research, because there is something to be said for mystery, for accepting that not everything can or should be known, and some have argued that the pyramids should be treated not as puzzles to be solved, but as sacred monuments to be respected, and that our modern desire to penetrate every secret and illuminate every darkness represents a kind of cultural imperialism, imposing our values of transparency and knowledge onto a culture that clearly valued concealment and mystery. And while this perspective has merit as a cautionary note, most researchers and most Egyptians involved in heritage management believe that careful, respectful investigation that advances understanding while preserving the monuments for future generations represents an appropriate balance, and that knowledge gained through archaeological research, far from disrespecting the ancient builders, honors them by taking their achievements seriously enough to study them deeply, and by revealing the sophistication and complexity of what they created, elevates appreciation of their civilization rather than diminishing it. The impact of climate change on preservation conditions at Giza is an emerging concern, because changing rainfall patterns, increasing temperatures, and rising humidity could alter the stable conditions that have preserved underground features for millennia. And while Egypt remains predominantly arid, climate models predict changes in precipitation that could affect groundwater levels, potentially flooding chambers that are currently dry, or changing the chemical environment in ways that accelerate deterioration of stone and any organic materials that might exist in sealed spaces. And monitoring these environmental changes and developing strategies to mitigate their impacts on archaeological preservation is becoming an important priority for heritage management, and this adds urgency to current documentation efforts, because conditions that have remained stable for thousands of years might change significantly within decades. And recording what exists now, while preservation is still good, ensures that future researchers will have baseline data even if physical conditions deteriorate. The educational value of sharing what we learn about underground chambers extends beyond academic circles to inspire new generations of archaeologists, engineers, and scientists, because the pyramids capture imaginations in ways that few ancient monuments can match, and young people who learn about the sophisticated scanning technologies being used to reveal hidden chambers, about the engineering challenges of excavating passages through solid rock, about the theological concepts encoded in the architecture, often find their interest sparked toward careers in science or archaeology or history. And this inspirational aspect, while intangible, represents a significant return on the investment in pyramid research, because fostering curiosity and analytical thinking about the past contributes to developing the human capital needed for future discovery and innovation. The comparative analysis of underground features across different cultures and time periods reveals that the impulse to create sacred or ceremonial spaces beneath the earth is widespread, appearing in contexts as diverse as Neolithic passage graves in Europe, kivas in the American Southwest, Buddhist cave temples in Asia, and catacombs in Rome, and this cross-cultural pattern suggests something fundamental about human psychology, a tendency to associate depth with sacredness, to imagine the underworld as both dangerous and powerful, and to create underground spaces for rituals that connect the living with the dead and with divine forces. And understanding the Egyptian underground chambers within this broader comparative framework helps us see both what is universal about underground sacred architecture and what is specifically Egyptian. What features reflect common human concerns and which represent unique cultural solutions to shared existential questions. The technical specifications of the underground chambers, their precise dimensions and orientations, provide data that can be analyzed mathematically to test various hypotheses about design principles and symbolic meanings, because the Egyptians clearly used mathematical relationships in their architecture, incorporating ratios and proportions that have been detected through careful measurement, and some researchers have proposed that these mathematical relationships encode astronomical, theological, or cosmological knowledge, while others argue they simply reflect practical construction techniques and aesthetic preferences. And distinguishing between these possibilities requires rigorous analysis that accounts for the limits of ancient measuring capabilities, the tolerances achievable with available tools, and the danger of finding patterns in data through confirmation bias, seeing relationships that seem significant but actually arise from chance or from our own expectations rather than from ancient intentions. The question of how knowledge about underground chamber construction was transmitted across generations in ancient Egypt raises interesting issues about education and professional training in ancient societies, because creating these complex underground features required specialized skills, knowledge of how to work stone, how to maintain accurate orientations while working in confined spaces, how to calculate volumes and plan logistics, and this knowledge had to be passed from experienced workers and architects to apprentices, probably through a combination of verbal instruction, demonstration, and hands-on practice. And while we have no direct evidence of how this training occurred, we can infer from the consistency and quality of work across different pyramid sites that effective training systems existed, and occasional mistakes or experiments visible in some structures might represent the work of less experienced workers or deliberate trials of new techniques. And studying these variations can provide insights into the learning process and the degree of standardization that ancient Egyptian building projects achieved. The symbolic significance of darkness in underground chambers deserves consideration, because these spaces were designed to be dark, to exist in permanent night, and darkness in Egyptian thought had complex meanings. It was associated with the underworld and with death, but also with the period before creation, with potential and possibility, with the fertile darkness of the earth from which new life springs, and the deceased pharaoh, descending into these dark chambers, was entering a space of transformation where the old identity would be shed and a new divine identity would emerge, like a seed in dark soil that sprouts into new life. And this symbolism of fertile darkness helps explain why the underground chambers were so important. They provided not just physical protection for the body, but the correct metaphysical environment for the resurrection process, the darkness necessary for regeneration. The integration of astronomical knowledge into underground chamber design becomes clearer when we consider that the Egyptians had sophisticated understanding of celestial mechanics, knew the cycles of stars and planets, could predict astronomical events, and used this knowledge in practical applications from agriculture to timekeeping, and incorporating astronomical alignments into their most important ritual architecture would have been natural, creating structures that connected earth to sky, that allowed the pharaoh spirit to ascend to the stars as the texts describe, and the underground passages descending from entrances oriented to specific celestial directions created physical pathways that mirrored and facilitated the metaphysical journey the deceased would undertake. And understanding these connections requires bringing together archaeological evidence, astronomical calculation, and textual analysis in ways that reveal the sophistication of Old Kingdom cosmological thought. The role of water in underground ritual practice might have extended beyond symbolic representation to actual ceremonial use, because we know that water played important roles in Egyptian religious ceremonies, used for purification, for libations to the gods, for ritual cleansing of objects and participants, and if underground chambers were used for ceremonies, as the evidence from the Osiris Shaft suggests, then water would likely have been part of those rituals, possibly brought from the Nile in ceremonial vessels, poured out as offerings, or used to ritually purify the space, and chemical analysis of residues on chamber floors and walls might detect traces of such ritual use, revealing details about ceremonies that took place in these hidden spaces more than 4,000 years ago. The documentation challenges posed by underground chambers include the difficulty of photography in confined dark spaces, the problems of creating accurate maps when you cannot see the overall layout, the need to protect sensitive equipment from dust and moisture, and the physical demands of working in cramped conditions for extended periods. And these practical challenges mean that comprehensive documentation of underground features has often lagged behind exploration, with chambers being entered and cursorily examined but not thoroughly recorded, and efforts to return to previously explored spaces with modern documentation technology sometimes reveal details and features that earlier visitors missed or did not recognize as significant, demonstrating the value of repeated examination with evolving methods and perspectives. The relationship between the underground chambers and the concept of Ma'at, the Egyptian principle of cosmic order, justice, and truth, provides another interpretive framework because the pharaoh was seen as the guarantor of Ma'at, the one whose rule ensured that chaos did not overwhelm order, and his death potentially threatened this cosmic balance, requiring elaborate rituals and architecture to ensure his successful resurrection so that Ma'at could be maintained. And the underground chambers, with their precise orientations and carefully calculated proportions, physically embodied Ma'at, representing order imposed on the chaos of the primordial bedrock, and the pharaoh's journey through these ordered spaces from death to resurrection paralleled and ensured the continuation of cosmic order from one reign to the next. And this understanding elevates the underground chambers from mere tombs to cosmic instruments, mechanisms essential to the functioning of the universe itself according to Egyptian thought. The evidence for multiple construction phases in some underground features suggests that pyramid complexes evolved over time, with chambers being modified, passages being extended or blocked, and new features being added. And this diachronic approach to understanding the underground architecture, looking at how it changed over time rather than treating it as a static unified design, reveals decision-making processes, changing priorities, responses to problems or opportunities that arose during construction, and possibly theological developments that required architectural modifications. And tracing these construction sequences requires careful attention to stratigraphic relationships, to which features cut through others, to differences in tool marks or construction techniques that might indicate different work crews or time periods, and to inconsistencies in the overall design that might signal changes in plan. The potential for discovering inscriptions or graffiti in unexplored chambers generates considerable excitement because ancient Egyptian workers and visitors sometimes left marks in hidden places, including the quarry marks and hieratic inscriptions found in the relieving chambers above the king's chamber, and such inscriptions can provide invaluable information about dates, names of work crews, administrative organization, and even the thoughts and concerns of the people who created these monuments. And a sealed chamber containing contemporary inscriptions about pyramid construction would be an extraordinary find, potentially answering long-debated questions about chronology, labor organization, and construction methods, and even informal graffiti. The ancient equivalent of Khufu's crew was here, would provide welcome humanizing details about the individuals whose work created these monuments but whose names have been mostly lost to history. The engineering analysis of underground features reveals sophisticated solutions to challenging problems, including the need to ventilate deep passages to provide breathable air for workers, the requirement to remove massive amounts of debris through narrow passages, the challenge of maintaining accurate orientations and angles while working in confined spaces with limited sight lines, and the structural concern of ensuring that chambers carved from bedrock would not collapse under the weight of the pyramid being built above them, and studying how ancient engineers solved these problems can inform modern engineering, because the principles of efficient excavation, structural stability, and project management transcend specific technologies, and solutions developed with simple tools and enormous human effort can sometimes be adapted to modern contexts in ways that high technology approaches might miss. The role of ritual closure in underground chambers, the ceremonies that would have accompanied the sealing of passages, and the final entombment of the pharaoh provides context for understanding features that otherwise seem purely structural, because the granite plugs blocking the ascending passage, the sealed doorways in various chambers, and the filled passages in some pyramids were not just security measures against robbers, but participated in ritual transformations, marking the transition from construction to sacred space, from accessible architecture to forbidden underworld, and the act of sealing was itself a ritual performance, investing the sealed spaces with power and meaning, transforming them from mere rooms to magical environments where resurrection could occur. And understanding this ritual dimension helps explain why such effort was invested in features that would immediately be hidden and inaccessible, because the hiding itself was meaningful, was part of the magic. The debate over whether to attempt to access the Big Void in the Great Pyramid illustrates the competing priorities in pyramid archaeology, because there is tremendous scientific interest in confirming what the void contains, whether it is a sealed chamber with artifacts, an empty structural space, or something else entirely. But accessing it would require drilling through the pyramid stone, creating a permanent modification to the monument that some consider unacceptable. And this debate has generated proposals for minimally invasive approaches, including using very small drill holes that could be sealed afterward, or attempting to reach the void through existing passages if connection can be found, or waiting for technology to develop to the point where investigation can occur without any physical intervention, perhaps through improved scanning that can determine the void's contents remotely. And how this debate is resolved will set important precedents for how we balance knowledge acquisition with preservation in the future. The significance of finding nothing in underground chambers should not be underestimated, because emptiness can be as meaningful as presence, particularly in contexts where we know that chambers were once filled but have been emptied, and the pattern of what was taken and what was left by ancient robbers can reveal what they valued, what they were looking for, and how thoroughly they searched. And chambers that appear never to have contained burial goods raise questions about whether they were intended for burials at all or served other purposes. Ritual spaces or symbolic features that were never meant to hold physical objects, and distinguishing between chambers that have been robbed and chambers that were always empty requires careful analysis of stratigraphy, looking for disturbance patterns, and of the chamber's features, determining whether they include elements like sarcophagi or equipment that suggests burial use. The impact of digital humanities approaches on pyramid research, using databases to aggregate and analyze information from multiple sites and sources, text mining to extract patterns from archaeological reports and ancient texts, and network analysis to map relationships between different features and interpret them systematically, represents a methodological shift that is transforming how we understand large architectural complexes, because these computational approaches can identify patterns across vast data sets that would be invisible to traditional qualitative analysis, can test hypotheses with statistical rigor, and can model complex systems in ways that reveal emergent properties and systemic relationships. In applying these methods to the underground chambers of Giza, creating comprehensive databases of measurements, features, and contextual information promises new insights into overall design principles and the relationships between different elements of the complex. The legacy of what we are learning about underground chambers extends beyond Egyptology to influence how we think about monumentality, memory, and the human relationship with death across cultures and time periods, because the Egyptian solution to mortality, investing enormous resources in creating physical structures that would ensure eternal life, represents one extreme on a spectrum of approaches that humans have developed, and understanding this approach in its full complexity, including the crucial role of underground spaces that were meant never to be seen again, challenges modern assumptions about visibility and access, about the relationship between effort and audience, and about what makes a monument meaningful. And these challenges are valuable precisely because they force us to think beyond our own cultural frameworks and consider radically different ways of understanding what matters and why. The application of conservation science to underground chambers, using techniques from materials science, chemistry, and biology to understand deterioration processes and develop preservation strategies, has revealed that these spaces face threats that are different from those affecting above-ground structures, including salt crystallization from groundwater, biological growth in humid conditions, and structural stresses from temperature and moisture fluctuations. And developing effective conservation requires understanding these specific threat mechanisms and testing interventions to ensure they help rather than harm. And this work proceeds slowly and carefully, because underground chambers cannot be easily monitored once sealed, and any conservation intervention must be sustainable over decades or centuries without requiring constant maintenance or adjustment. The question of what future technologies might reveal about what lies beneath the pyramids is tantalizing, because the pace of technological development in fields relevant to archaeology, including sensor technology, imaging systems, data analysis, algorithms, and material science, continues to accelerate, and capabilities that seem impossible today might become routine within decades, and we might eventually be able to create complete three-dimensional maps of everything beneath the Giza plateau without drilling a single hole or moving a single stone, might be able to identify the composition of materials in sealed chambers without opening them, might be able to read inscriptions through meters of solid rock, and these future capabilities will open new research questions even as they answer current ones. And the data we are collecting today, carefully documented and archived, will become more valuable as analytical methods improve, allowing future researchers to extract insights that we cannot yet imagine from information that we are gathering now. The personal stories of the archaeologists and researchers who have dedicated their careers to studying what lies beneath the pyramids deserve recognition, because behind every discovery is a human story of obsession and dedication, of years spent in uncomfortable conditions pursuing questions that might never be answered, of frustrations and disappointments balanced by moments of breakthrough and revelation. And these individuals, from early explorers like Caviglia and Paring, who first mapped the underground passages in the 19th century, to modern researchers like Hawass and the ScanPyramids team, who are revealing new features with 21st century technology, have each contributed pieces to our understanding, and their combined efforts across generations have built the knowledge we now possess. And this collaborative nature of archaeological research, where each generation builds on what previous researchers discovered and passes their own findings to future researchers, embodies a kind of immortality different from what the pharaohs sought, but equally enduring, the immortality of contributing to human knowledge and understanding. The relationship between what we know and what remains unknown about underground chambers creates a productive tension that drives ongoing research, because confidence that we understand the basic purposes and meanings of these spaces coexists with awareness that major discoveries remain possible, that our current understanding is incomplete and possibly wrong in significant ways. And this combination of knowledge and uncertainty, of confidence and humility, represents the healthy state of a vibrant research field, because absolute certainty would signal that there is nothing left to learn, while complete uncertainty would indicate that we have made no progress, and the balance we have achieved, substantial understanding combined with recognition of major remaining questions, keeps the field intellectually alive and attracts new researchers with new perspectives and new methods who can push understanding forward. The significance of the Giza Plateau as a UNESCO World Heritage Site adds layers of complexity to research and conservation, because this designation recognizes the site's universal value to humanity as a whole, not just to Egypt, and it brings international obligations and scrutiny, requirements to maintain and protect the monuments according to international standards, and opportunities for global collaboration and support. And this international dimension means that decisions about how to investigate underground features are not purely Egyptian internal matters, but involve global stakeholders who have legitimate interests in how these irreplaceable monuments are studied and preserved. and balancing Egyptian sovereignty over their own heritage with international concern for monuments that belong to world history requires diplomacy and mutual respect, and most of the time this balance is achieved successfully, but occasional tensions arise and must be negotiated. The educational programs that bring students and early career researchers to work on pyramid archaeology, providing hands-on experience with excavation, documentation, and analysis, ensure that expertise and knowledge are transmitted to new generations because the skills required for this work are not taught in textbooks but must be learned through apprenticeship and practice. And senior researchers who mentor students and junior colleagues are investing in the future of the field, ensuring that when they retire, capable successors will continue the work, and this generational succession is crucial for long-term research programs that span decades, because individual careers end, but the monuments endure, and maintaining institutional memory and methodological continuity requires deliberate effort to train new researchers and integrate them into ongoing projects. The impact of social media and digital communication on public engagement with pyramid archaeology has been profound, because discoveries that once would have been announced in academic journals and reached public awareness only through delayed and filtered media reports can now be shared instantly with global audiences, and researchers can communicate directly with interested publics, explaining their work, sharing images and videos from underground chambers, and responding to questions and misconceptions. And this direct communication builds public support for archaeological research and helps counter pseudoscientific claims by providing accurate information from authoritative sources. And while managing social media presence adds to researchers' workloads, many have found it rewarding to engage with the enthusiasm and curiosity that people worldwide bring to Egyptian archaeology. The synthesis of everything we have learned about what lies beneath the pyramids reveals a picture of extraordinary complexity and sophistication, of architecture that operated on multiple levels simultaneously, serving practical functions of housing burials and protecting them from disturbance, symbolic functions of representing cosmic geography and theological concepts, ritual functions of providing spaces for ceremonies and transformations, and magical functions of actually accomplishing the resurrection of the deceased through the power of properly designed and oriented space. And all of these functions were integrated into unified structures where every element contributed to the whole. And understanding this integration requires us to think simultaneously about engineering, theology, astronomy, mathematics, art, and politics. To recognize that these monuments were created by people who saw no contradiction between practical skill and spiritual purpose, who believed that precise craftsmanship in service of divine goals was the highest calling, and who invested their society's resources and their own lives' labor in creating something that would endure beyond any individual lifetime and accomplish purposes that transcended the merely human. As Dr. Sarah Chin emerged from the Osiris Shaft after her dive into that flooded chamber, the desert sun blinding after hours in darkness, water streaming from her equipment, and her mind filled with images of the massive sarcophagus surrounded by black water, she carried with her the awareness that she had been somewhere that connects us across millennia to people whose names we will never know, but whose vision and determination created something that still has the power to awe and inspire, and that the story of what lies beneath the pyramids is not a story with a final chapter, not a mystery that will be completely solved, but an ongoing dialogue between past and present, between the dead who created these spaces and the living who study them, and that every discovery, every new chamber revealed, every anomaly detected by scanning, every insight gained from analysis, brings us not to a conclusion but to a deeper appreciation of how much there is still to learn, how much the ancient Egyptians knew and accomplished that we are only beginning to understand, and how these monuments continue to guard their secrets while slowly, incrementally, revealing them to those patient and dedicated enough to listen. The future of pyramid archaeology will undoubtedly bring discoveries that will surprise us, that will challenge our current understanding and force us to revise theories that seem well established, because the history of the field has been one of continual revelation and reinterpretation, and there is no reason to think that process has ended. And as we stand on the threshold of new technological capabilities and new theoretical approaches, we can anticipate findings that will be as revolutionary as the discovery of the Big Void or the identification of the Ahramat Branch. And these future discoveries will not just add facts to our knowledge, but will reshape our fundamental understanding of what the pyramids were and what they meant. And this ongoing transformation of understanding is what makes archaeology not a dead cataloging of the past, but a living conversation with it. A dialogue that changes both our understanding of ancient Egypt and our understanding of ourselves. The monuments themselves, standing silent in the desert sun while concealing their underground secrets, remain the ultimate authorities, the final arbiters of our theories and interpretations. Because they exist independent of our understanding of them, they were what they were and meant what they meant regardless of whether we comprehend them correctly, and our task as researchers is to listen to what they tell us, to observe carefully, to measure precisely, to analyze rigorously, and to interpret humbly, always aware that our conclusions are provisional, that new evidence might require us to abandon cherished ideas, and that the monuments know more than we do and will continue to teach us if we remain open to learning. The story of what lies beneath Egypt's pyramids, then, is a story still being written, with chapters yet to be added, by discoveries yet to be made, interpreted by researchers yet to be trained, using technologies yet to be invented. And what we know now represents not the conclusion of the investigation, but a progress report, a summary of how far we have come in understanding these extraordinary monuments, and an acknowledgement of how far we have yet to go, and whether the next great discovery comes from accessing a sealed chamber, or from reinterpreting evidence that has been visible all along, from deploying new scanning technology, or from reading ancient texts with fresh eyes, from excavating beneath the sand, or from synthesizing data across multiple disciplines. It will continue the process of revelation that began when the first modern explorer descended into the darkness beneath the pyramids. And that will continue as long as humans remain curious about the achievements of their ancestors and the mysteries that stone and sand conceal. The relationship between the underground chambers and the concept of Ma'at, the Egyptian principle of cosmic order, justice, and truth, provides another interpretive framework, because the pharaoh was seen as the guarantor of Ma'at, the one whose rule ensured that chaos did not overwhelm order, and his death potentially threatened this cosmic balance, requiring elaborate rituals and architecture to ensure his successful resurrection so that Ma'at could be maintained, and the underground chambers, with their precise orientations and carefully calculated proportions, physically embodied Ma'at, representing order imposed on the chaos of the primordial bedrock, and the pharaoh's journey through these ordered spaces from death to resurrection paralleled and ensured the continuation of cosmic order from one reign to the next, and this understanding elevates the underground chambers from mere tombs to cosmic instruments, mechanisms essential to the functioning of the universe itself, according to Egyptian thought. The evidence for multiple construction phases in some underground features suggests that pyramid complexes evolved over time, with chambers being modified, passages being extended or blocked, and new features being added. And this diachronic approach to understanding the underground architecture, looking at how it changed over time rather than treating it as a static unified design, reveals decision-making processes, changing priorities, responses to problems or opportunities that arose during construction, and possibly theological developments that required architectural modifications. And tracing these construction sequences requires careful attention to stratigraphic relationships, to which features cut through others, to differences in tool marks or construction techniques that might indicate different work crews or time periods, and to inconsistencies in the overall design that might signal changes in plan. The potential for discovering inscriptions or graffiti in unexplored chambers generates considerable excitement, because ancient Egyptian workers and visitors sometimes left marks in hidden places, including the quarry marks and hieratic inscriptions found in the relieving chambers above the king's chamber. And such inscriptions can provide invaluable information about dates, names of work crews, administrative organization, and even the thoughts and concerns of the people who created these monuments. And a sealed chamber containing contemporary inscriptions about pyramid construction would be an extraordinary find, potentially answering long debated questions about chronology, labor organization, and construction methods, and even informal graffiti, the ancient equivalent of workers leaving their mark, would provide welcome, humanizing details about the individuals whose work created these monuments, but whose names have been mostly lost to history. The engineering analysis of underground features reveals sophisticated solutions to challenging problems, including the need to ventilate deep passages to provide breathable air for workers, the requirement to remove massive amounts of debris through narrow passages, the challenge of maintaining accurate orientations and angles while working in confined spaces with limited sight lines, and the structural concern of ensuring that chambers carved from bedrock would not collapse under the weight of the pyramid being built above them, and studying how ancient engineers solved these problems can inform modern engineering, because the principles of efficient excavation, structural stability, and project management transcend specific technologies, and solutions developed with simple tools and enormous human effort can sometimes be adapted to modern contexts in ways that high technology approaches might miss. The role of ritual closure in underground chambers, the ceremonies that would have accompanied the sealing of passages, and the final entombment of the pharaoh provides context for understanding features that otherwise seem purely structural, because the granite plugs blocking the ascending passage, the sealed doorways in various chambers, and the filled passages in some pyramids were not just security measures against robbers, but participated in ritual transformations, marking the transition from construction to sacred space, from accessible architecture to forbidden underworld. And the act of sealing was itself a ritual performance, investing the sealed spaces with power and meaning, transforming them from mere rooms to magical environments where resurrection could occur. And understanding this ritual dimension helps explain why such effort was invested in features that would immediately be hidden and inaccessible, because the hiding itself was meaningful, was part of the magic. The debate over whether to attempt to access the Big Void in the Great Pyramid illustrates the competing priorities in pyramid archaeology, because there is tremendous scientific interest in confirming what the void contains, whether it is a sealed chamber with artifacts, an empty structural space, or something else entirely, but accessing it would require drilling through the pyramid stone, creating a permanent modification to the monument that some consider unacceptable, and this debate has generated proposals for minimally invasive approaches, including using very small drill holes that could be sealed afterward, or attempting to reach the void through existing passages if connection can be found, or waiting for technology to develop to the point where investigation can occur without any physical intervention, perhaps through improved scanning that can determine the void's contents remotely. And how this debate is resolved will set important precedents for how we balance knowledge acquisition with preservation in the future. The significance of finding nothing in underground chambers should not be underestimated, because emptiness can be as meaningful as presence, particularly in contexts where we know that chambers were once filled but have been emptied, and the pattern of what was taken and what was left by ancient robbers can reveal what they valued, what they were looking for, and how thoroughly they searched. And chambers that appear never to have contained burial goods raise questions about whether they were intended for burials at all or served other purposes. Ritual spaces or symbolic features that were never meant to hold physical objects. And distinguishing between chambers that have been robbed and chambers that were always empty requires careful analysis of stratigraphy, looking for disturbance patterns, and of the chamber's features, determining whether they include elements like sarcophagi or equipment that suggest burial use. The impact of digital humanities approaches on pyramid research, using databases to aggregate and analyze information from multiple sites and sources, text mining to extract patterns from archaeological reports and ancient texts, and network analysis to map relationships between different features and interpret them systematically, represents a methodological shift that is transforming how we understand large architectural complexes, because these computational approaches can identify patterns across vast data sets that would be invisible to traditional qualitative analysis, can test hypotheses with statistical rigor, and can model complex systems in ways that reveal emergent properties and systemic relationships. And applying these methods to the underground chambers of Giza, creating comprehensive databases of measurements, features, and contextual information, promises new insights into overall design principles and the relationships between different elements of the complex.